We are in chapter 11 called George's Children. How we crave arrangement, often overwhelmed by the incalculable sadness Georgia had endangered, aware of the many of her direct victims who wished to speak with other birth parents or adoptees, and to form a support group. I would refrain from returning that day's transcribed interviews to their separate folders, leaving them instead in a companionable pile. Then, reaching for a fresh legal pad, I'd list concrete facts about Georgia's story. They would seem so orderly, so neat, so irrelevant. I understand your sense of outrage, an elderly Memphis attorney had told me, but what is the point of writing this book? And so blessedly often, as I rooted through the arrangements, I defected upon the information stored in folders, and in my brain for answers that were never where I thought I'd find them. I'd heard from someone who had imposed upon her life patterns more meaningful than any I could create. Ruby Burdett, who had completed a circle with her love home. Adoptee Heidi Naylor, who had loved and cared for her over 60 foster children. Another adoptee, Mary Margolis of St. Louis, Missouri, had begun speaking to small groups about her family's dissolution. One of 4 children stolen by Georgia Tann from their mother, Irene Green, Mary Margolis had reunited with her sisters and brother after separation of 60 years. By then, Irene had died, but the siblings had a warm, close relationship. How your audience must applaud, I told Mary. She corrected me gently. They're usually too busy crying. My comment had been clumsy, but I was often made inarticulate by such evidence of human resilience and common sense. To have transformed a personal tragedy into a vehicle for helping or informing others seemed noble. Where were we? The recounting of such feats seemed sufficient reason for any book. I didn't know how many of Georgia's adoptees had managed to use their experience to help others, or even to survive. But I was speaking frequently with one who was desperately trying to survive, my phone companion, Billy Hale. Upon taking early retirement from his job in Portland, Oregon, shortly after watching the 60 Minutes episode on Georgia Tann, Billy had returned to Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Some of the best years of my life were spent there with my adoptive parents, he told me in an explanation. I knew, however, that they were now dead. Billy had trouble finding employment, but a childhood friend hired him to do carpentry work and let him park his trailer on his estate. From this vantage point, Billy visited his birth uncle, aunts, and cousins in nearby Duffield, Virginia, where they were friendly, but Billy wasn't able to see them as often as he wished. He sent me pictures of his trailer and a recent one of himself. When I met Billy 3 years earlier, he'd had short hair and worn jeans and golf shirts and a small Native American necklace. Billy's hair was long now, parted in the middle and swept back over his shoulders. He had shaved his mustache. These changes, including a larger silver and turquoise medallion and an unemotional stoic expression, connoted a stereotypical Native American appearance that contrasted with how Billy had looked only 1 year earlier. Seemed disconcerting. Was there one real Billy? I wasn't sure he thought so. Having been forced to confront memories that he'd been told were false, he was struggling to absorb them. His adult past had disappeared into the void. His dead mother, Molly, had become more real than any living person. Given her poverty and proximity to Memphis, Molly hadn't had a chance. Upon the relocation of her parents and 3 youngest brothers to Ohio, she left Virginia for Kingsport, Tennessee, where her sister Frances was a waitress. Molly waited tables also until a middle-aged married farmer offered her a more lucrative post. He was evil, despicable, a terrible person, Billy told me repeatedly. His own self-image had never been strong, and when I sensed the additional pain of discovery of the character of the man who'd fathered him, I understood why Billy had protected himself by writing his own book in the third person. Okay, pausing here. I told a little bit about my own biological father in the last chapter, and I can definitely understand as I'd want to separate myself from any of that as well. But we also have to remember that there are going to be elements of our biological parents, whether good or bad, that we get, right? And so my suggestion as an adoptee is take the good and leave the bad. If you are breaking generational curses, break them. Be strong. Hold firm. Right? Yeah. That's what I gotta say. Anyway. When Molly told the farmer of her pregnancy, he threw her out. Billy had written she went to a shelter for unwed mothers and on February 10th, 1939, delivered a 6-pound, 13-ounce baby boy. Molly's prospects were bleak. She was laid off from work in a laundry and unable to find work, brought Billy by bus to visit her parents, but the depression had hit Ohio almost as hard as Virginia. Molly not only found no work, but discovered her parents to be so poor that she gave them most of her remaining money. Then, unable to afford bus fare back to Kingsport, she got off at a town 25 miles outside it, and carrying an 18-month-old Billy, walked the rest of the way. Molly's sister Frances told Billy how, encountering a storm en route, his mother had taken refuge in an abandoned shed, where she sheltered him from the water pouring through the chinks in the tin roof, with a blanket fashioned from her sweater. Shortly after reaching Kingsport, she was offered a housekeeping position with a farming family, a job with prospects greater than its nature or location. On a street called Poor Hollow Road suggested. The job wasn't located in a particularly poor area, and her employer didn't bother her once. He and his wife had children, lived in the black and white 2-story main house. Molly and Billy stayed in a 3-room clapboard cottage. This was the cottage that Billy had visited in 1992. It was shaded by oak trees and willows, accessed by crossing a wooden bridge foraging a small stream. When he crossed it, a Rhode Island red hen, so a chicken, and her 12 chicks traversed the short span with him. On a nearby dirt road, children kicked up dust balls playing tag. The 3 years Molly spent there had been her best, he was sure. Her next job was with another farming family who believed the presence of almost 5-year-old Billy would prove distracting. Her sister had moved to Pennsylvania. Molly had no other relatives close by. She was forced to board him for 6 days a week at a small institution called the Faith Home. It would not be for long, she promised him, Billy wrote. She searched desperately for other work, but even for a short stay in a Tennessee orphanage tempted fate too much. Billy wasn't sure when he was spotted. In 1993, he spoke with another former Faith Home resident who, 8 years older than he, recalled more detail, including having been driven with Billy and several other children to Memphis church to sing. Had Georgia arranged this visit? Were the children auditioning for parts they would never want? Billy would never know. But shortly afterward, 2 of Georgia's workers arrived in a black chauffeur-driven limousine and told him they were taking him for a ride. Then on to Memphis, where Billy would experience the things he'd spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Molly didn't learn of Billy's abduction until 72 hours later, when she went to pick him up on a Saturday. Sitting on the counter of the reception area the basket of eggs that constituted partial payment for his boarding. She asked to see him. "He's not here," said Belle Hall, the matron. Molly stared in surprise. "He's gone with the social workers," as Molly began to scream. Belle added, "They had papers. It was legal." Billy's Aunt Frances told him that Molly had then assaulted Belle, breaking her nose. Records of his mother's subsequent arrest and imprisonment had been destroyed by the time Billy asked to see them in 1990s. Hitting Belle was the last decisive action of Molly's life. Losing him, Billy wrote in his book, left her broken without spirit. On one of her futile visits to orphanages and police stations in Virginia, Kentucky, North Carolina, and eastern Tennessee, she met a trucker named Wallace Harper, who lived on the wild side. Briefly, Molly lived on the wild side too. Molly's life could be considered wild, Billy added, only in comparison to the one she had lived before. After her marriage, she wore makeup and drank beer. She does appear in a photo taken of the couple in the early 1950s, more worldly than before. Wallace, his greasy hair in a pompadour, his collar spread-eagled over what appears a black lounge suit, resembles a gangster. He saw himself, however, as a Lothario. Knowledge of his affairs, both in Kingsport and after he joined the Air Force in 1952 in San Diego and Los Angeles, devastated Molly. But she didn't want a divorce, Billy wrote. Wallace was all she had. Even without a divorce, she lived a solitary life, remaining in Kingsport during Wallace's tours of duty, both because of his desire for freedom and her own reluctance to leave the town in which she had last seen her son. She gardened and kept pets. She also maintained a scrapbook that, Billy said, allowed him to look straight into her soul. It contains the card she would have given him on his 5th birthday, and a postcard of a little boy perched on a rock in a stream, his head averted. Did she pretend it was Billy? And there were newspaper articles carefully clipped, garnered from different papers over a span of 20 years, but always with the same theme. Tyke survives snake. Gators after being dumped in Georgia's swamp. Police examined buried wooden box near Nampsmund, Virginia, on the edge of a dismal swamp, where a 13-year-old boy was held chained for 8 days. Kelly is better than sheriff's deputies in Miami, Florida found Kelly Putin in a cage. He weighed only 14 pounds, and now he's up to 24. Doing fine, Charlotte Johnson, 7 months of Fairbanks, Alaska, is recovered from several hours exposure to negative 40-degree temperatures. Knoxville police believe kidnapped child is still alive. The scrapbook also contains pictures of Billy as a toddler and of Molly growing older. One showing her at age 50 lifting the edges of her square dance dress to show a peacock fan. Heartened Billy, she's smiling. Another shows her at 70, her hair white and permed, with her favorite big brother. She is with Harrison, too, in the last snapshot, taken before her death. He hugs her. She is crying. She had been talking. Harrison told Billy of him. Molly was one of the unknowable number of parents who died without learning if their children had survived into adulthood. Many had not. Georgia seemed immune to guilt and never publicly expressed sorrow about a single child's death. She also denied the accusations of local pediatricians that scores of her children had perished, admitting only to 2 deaths which she had occurred in October of 1945. She refused to even acknowledge illness in her children and forbade her boarding mothers from summoning medical help. Faced with desperately sick children, however, some boarding mothers panicked and sent them to the hospital. The trip was often made too late. The deaths of most of these babies were presumably recorded and the children buried in the area of Elmwood Cemetery used by her adoption agency. But Georgia disposed of the bodies of children whose deaths she could conceal in less regular ways. A reporter for the Gibraltar passed Georgia's home one night in the 1940s and saw someone burying something in the backyard. A child, the reporter believed. Former investigator Robert Taylor told me that Georgia had the local Thompson Brothers funeral home cremate some of the children, getting rid of evidence, Taylor said. A grave is proof. No death certificates were issued for many of these children. There were a lot of deaths nobody knew anything about, pediatrician Clyde Croswell said in 1950. As terrible as these deaths were, they seemed sadder upon consideration of their causes, which were usually heat prostration or a combination of starvation and dehydration caused by gastrointestinal infection, painful ways to die. The deaths could easily have been prevented had Georgia respected the children's fragility and medical advice. Charles Carter, a pediatrician who in the 1940s volunteered his services to the home, was particularly disturbed by Georgia's overriding of his orders regarding a very sick infant. I had prescribed penicillin, and later learned that she ordered her nurses to stop giving it to the baby, but continued to chart it as if they were, he told me. Georgia Tan simply would not listen. She would say, "I'll take your words under advisement," but she never did. And she did what she felt was best. Regardless of what anyone said, she felt she knew the babies and what the babies needed. So this woman is not only, she's not, let me rephrase that. This Georgia Tan is neglecting these children in many ways, medically, emotionally, without food, without clothing, without love and education. And she was never charged. Never charged. By the time they even caught on to her, which is ridiculous because lots of people knew what she was doing, right? She died. But then to cover up all of her crimes, right? And to never even prosecute those that were in her circle, because let's face it, she did not do this alone. They just let this shit go. This is a huge problem, and this is why we have to speak up on behalf of children. Excuse me. I got a runny nose now. Okay. Anyway. The common practice in the 1930s and 1940s was to hospitalize full-term infants for a week and premature babies until they weighed over 5 pounds. Georgia, however, sometimes took children only a few hours after birth, and often quickly transported them to adoptive home thousands of miles away. Babies arrived at their new homes feverish and dehydrated. Some died shortly after their journey, including an infant girl sent to a New Jersey couple to whom Georgia had previously sent a baby boy with a heart defect. The poor health of many of Georgia's children was such a constant and well-known fact that Memphis Hospital reserved an entire ward for their care. A hospital in Los Angeles also maintained a ward for many sick babies she sent to local adoptive parents. Physicians in these states and others complained about Georgia to the Department of Public Welfare and the state director of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, but no one curbed her. She continued to cause child deaths. Okay, despite their complaining, right? Despite, so people are reporting her, but nothing's being done. They don't care. They don't care. These children are literally sick and dying. You have entire wards in hospitals, right? They just said in Memphis as well as in Los Angeles and who knows where else. She's being reported and they're not doing anything. It really just shows that people don't care about children. Oh my goodness. Okay. By 1932, only 8 years after Georgia's arrival in Memphis, the city had the highest recorded infant death rate of any U.S. city of over 100,000 residents. Over the next 2 years, the recorded Memphis infant mortality rate soared even higher, and a true number of babies who died was higher than was ever recorded, since Georgia frequently failed to report her children's deaths. Think about that. Think about that. Like, what? Okay. The report rate, however, was sufficiently disturbing that in 1935, the U.S. Children's Bureau sent Dr. Ella Oppenheimer to Memphis to investigate the cause. She found it quickly the most striking difference in cause of mortality between Memphis and the cities with which it is compared is mortality from gastrointestinal disease among white infants, which in 1934 was very much higher in Memphis than in any other cities except Louisville. She wrote in her report, infant mortality in Memphis. Wait, what just happened? Hold on. I lost where I was. It's like my... What the... Okay, here. Georgia Tann dealt only with white children, and the most frequent cause of death of these children she boarded was gastrointestinal disease. Dr. Oppenheimer also noted that many of the Memphis deaths occurred in Memphis General Hospital, the very hospital in which Georgia's boarding home mothers, defying Georgia's orders, frequently sent sick children. Dr. Oppenheimer's search for facts was hampered by Georgia's lying. On July 2nd, 1935, the executive of the Tennessee Children's Home Society in Memphis, aka Georgia Tann, stated that no infant had died since the beginning of the calendar year. Dr. Oppenheimer wrote, but she must have doubted Georgia's truthfulness. In infant mortality in Memphis, the doctor implicitly criticized Georgia for taking babies from hospitals and maternity residents earlier than was medically recommended, and then often placing them in unregulated boarding homes. She strongly urged that these boarding homes be licensed and that they be supervised by the state. So again, the homes that Georgia is sending these children to are not licensed. They're not prepared. She is an unlicensed adoption agency and foster care agency as well. So technically she could have been doing this all legally, but she wasn't. But clearly nobody like cares, at this. I shouldn't say nobody cares, but like, let's be real. The people that could actually make a huge difference and change and stop her didn't care. Well, let's put it that way. Dr. Oppenheimer's recommendation had no immediate impact on Georgia, who continued to do whatever she wished. The first real attempt to curb her occurred in 1943, 6 years after the formation of the Tennessee Department of Public Welfare. The department's commissioner was, like virtually every politician in the state, intimidated by Georgia and her attorney Abe Waldor, a major lieutenant in Crump's machine. Some of the department's employees collaborated with Georgia, but other social workers were more concerned with the welfare of her children than politics, and they wanted the state licensing board of boarding homes that Dr. Oppenheimer had recommended. In preparation for this, Roberta Miller, director of the Child Welfare Division of the Department of Public Welfare, conducted a study of 10 Memphis boarding homes for children. In 1944, one of her caseworkers, Faye Willis, reported the study's results in the Tennessee Public Welfare Record. 9 of the 10 boarding homes were overcrowded. One 2-room apartment housed 10 children, and another 6 infants shared a single crib. A third home lacked refrigeration, and newborns were being fed spoiled milk. Oh. Look, I know that we still have some of these issues, not to the same extent, but some of the same issues, like, I shouldn't say I find it funny, but, so my home is not set up to foster because I don't have the room as much as I would love it. Every child is technically supposed to have their own room, right? However, they will stick a lot of children in one room even today, right? And 6 babies in one crib, no refrigeration, being fed spoiled milk. Like, this is just setting everyone up for failure. Let's just be honest. Yeah. One child suffering from syphilis and another from tuberculosis lived in 2 other boarding homes. Georgia had refused to allow them medical treatment. 16 more children lived in the attic of a house that the fire department had condemned as a fire trap. And 2-year-old twins lived with a 79-year-old boarding mother who, nearly blind and too senile to remember their names, addressed them as old man and old lady and fed them bread scraps. Tennessee is one of the few remaining states which has no legislation regulating boarding homes for children, Roberta Miller wrote in What Do You Know About the Tennessee's Adoption Laws, published in the Tennessee Public Record in 1944. We would not go to a beauty shop or a restaurant which is unlicensed. Yet, by our inertia and lack of interest in safeguarding children, we sit back and wink at the commercial boarding homes operating in Tennessee for babies and small children. Roberta Miller and Faye Willis knew that Georgia Tann was the person using most of these commercial boarding homes. In Tennessee's boss-ridden environment, however, they were apparently afraid to say so outright, and their articles never mentioned Georgia's name. Nevertheless, Georgia and her attorney were incensed by both pieces. Abe Waldor wrote several heated letters of complaint to Miller's boss, Commissioner of Public Welfare William Schoaf. But Miller, Wallace, and other ethical social workers forged on, drafting an ordinance requiring regulation of children's boarding homes and persuading local newspaper to publicize the need to safeguard children's health. The workers must have celebrated when, in 1945, the legislation passed a law mandating the licensing and inspection of every children's boarding home in Tennessee. But while the social workers had toiled, Georgia and Abe had worked too, exercising their political clout. A subsection of the new law exempted any boarding homes used by Georgia Tann's agency from compliance. The heck? Oh my gosh. Of course, they're protecting her. This is like ridiculous. She had won again, and children in her boarding homes continued to die. So did children in her home on Poplar Avenue, which had opened in 1943, and where the conditions were possibly even worse than in the boarding residences. In summer, the heat was unbearable, said Mrs. Leon Sims of Philadelphia, Mississippi, who worked in George's home throughout 1943. It was particularly hard on the children with fevers, Georgia called her and the other 2 caretaker nurses. But none of us were honestly nurses, she told me. I was the only person on duty at night and cared for as many as 25 children. Everyone needed attention, but I simply didn't have enough time. There was a lot of illness. The main problem was diarrhea. Gastrointestinal illness is, as Dr. Oppenheimer of the U.S. Children's Bureau had noted, a serious problem in babies, whose bodies were so small they can dehydrate within hours, particularly a severe epidemic of the disease in Georgia's home in 1945, caused the deaths of 40 to 50 children in less than 4 months. This was despite the efforts of pediatrician Clyde Croswell, who volunteered his services to the home, who had urged her to hospitalize her sick infants and not admit any more children into her orphanage. She didn't follow the instructions, he told Memphis Reporter in 1950, after having remonstrated with Georgia, who insisted that only 2 children had died. Dr. Croswell met with Abe Waldor and other members of her board of directors. I offered to show them a list of the infants who had died, a staggering toll, he said. They didn't want to see it. Doctors Croswell and Carter and 4 other Memphis physicians complained to probate court Judge Samuel Bates, whose court had long officiated over Georgia's adoptions. In May of 1946, Judge Bates wrote a 6-page, single-spaced letter to the Commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Public Welfare, William Shove, detailing the doctor's complaints. Some concerned the dysentery epidemic that had killed 40 to 50 children, Georgia's failures to properly screen adoptive parents, the advertisement of particular children for adoption, and her failure to assess the care of children received in their adoptive homes. Among others, reported were Dr. C.E. James, who maintains an office in the Methodist Hospital, stated that the babies released to the Tennessee Children's Home Society that were born at the Methodist Hospital all would leave there in perfect health, but in many instances were returned in 1 or 2 months in an emancipated condition, and that many of them died as a result of neglect. He recalled an instance where a child was given to prospective adoptive parents, but that it lived only 2 weeks. Dr. Croswell stated that he had advised Miss Tan not to bring the babies out of the hospital before they weighed at least 5 pounds, but she continued to disregard his advice. On an occasion, he told her not to bring any children into the home because of an infection, but she brought in 5 and 3 or 4 of them died. Miss Tan, according to Dr. Croswell, had a woman assistant by the name of Flanagan, who frequently came on duty in a drunken condition. She gave castor oil in disregard of his instructions. Dr. Croswell secured the services of a registered nurse and tried to put her in charge of the babies. But Miss Tan would not permit this, with the result that the nurse left. Dr. Croswell said he couldn't be party to things going on of that type and continued a good citizen, so he discontinued his connection with the Tennessee's Children's Home Society. The mortality rate that is reported is nothing in comparison to what it actually is. Judge Bates' letter amounted to a show cause order. Unless his charges were proven to be untrue or Georgia Tan was removed from her position as head of the Memphis branch of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, he wrote, he would stop approving her adoptions. Judge Bates wanted Shove to investigate Georgia and shut her down. As the commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Public Welfare, Shove had the power to do so. His successor, J.O. McMahon, would close the home after her death. Shove was, however, a politician, and in 1946, Boss Crump still controlled Tennessee. Shove handed the responsibility of investigating Georgia Tan over to Georgia's attorney, Abe Waldor, and other members of her board of directors. They read Georgia's 6-page rebuttal, a characteristic mix of deflection, indignation, and lies. Dr. James' statement that in many instances babies released to the Tennessee Children's Home Society in perfect health were returned in 2 or 3 months in an emancipated condition, and that many of them died is not true. Some of our babies died, she admitted to 2, but not from the neglect on the part of the Tennessee Children's Home Society. This is an infamous attack. Abe Waldor and other board members grilled Doctors Croswell and Carter, then issued a report finding the physicians' charges groundless, irresponsible, and valueless, and false from the beginning to end. The Public Welfare Commissioner, to whom Judge Bates had appealed, William Schoaf, did nothing. Mr. Waldor told me that I had no authority in the matter, Schoaf said. Judge Bates was less intimidated by Georgia and her attorney than Schoaf, and then he stopped approving her adoptions. This, however, didn't faze Georgia. She and Waldor simply spoke to judges in rural Tennessee counties such as Haywood, Hardman, and Dwyer. These small-town judges weren't even lawyers, but they were politically savvy, and they signed whatever adoption decrees she wished. Georgia's ability to operate freely, even after Judge Bates' complaints, was of course attributable to her connection to Boss Crump, but she was also indirectly enabled by the generally held attitude that adoptable children were expendable. The author of an article in a 1930 issue of the Sunday Evening Post wrote of the plethora of babies to choose from: beautiful babies, ugly babies, brilliant babies, dull babies, healthy babies, sick babies, handicapped babies, babies with blue eyes, brown eyes, black eyes, with golden hair, black hair, curly, locked, and straight, babies thin, babies fat, babies 3 days old, 3 months old, or years old, and all the way stations in between. Babies with full family histories and babies with no family history, without age, name, or birth certificate, unknown waifs tossed into alleyways or dumped into garbage cans. Children in such a market, the article continued, to sell themselves. Blue eyes were decided advantage, as was the female gender. Baby girls are more feminine, alluring. They are grand little self-advertisers, and they are known instinctively how to strut their stuff. They stretch out their dimpled arms, gurgle at some secret baby joke, blow air bubbles from moist Cupid's bow mouths, and women headstrong men grow mad, becoming besotted with adoration and want to kidnap them on the spot. The author contended that males with the wrong hair color were at a distinct disadvantage. If a boy is a redhead, his chance of finding a new mama and papa is practically zero. Nobody wants him at all. The reporter didn't name her sources. She appeared to have two. One of them, who was director of the New York State Agency, neither was as successful as Georgia in arranging adoptions. Much of Georgia's success depended upon her baby ads, which, while enjoyed by Memphians, appalled many outsiders. I moved to Memphis in 1936 and was horrified to see on the front page of the paper a picture of a little boy that was going to be given away. Former press scimitar reporter Alfred Anderson told me they didn't do things like that in Texas. When the Christmas baby ads became syndicated in the 1930s, they attracted the disapproval of Charles C. Carstens, executive director of the Child Welfare League of America. Georgia ignored his warnings to stop the ads, which his successor, Howard W. Hopkirk, cited in 1941 as a main cause for the expulsion of Georgia and the statewide Tennessee Children's Home Society from the League. Other reasons cited were Georgia's failures to assess the fitness of adoptive parents and to supervise children in their new homes. Hopkirk was unaware that Georgia was also kidnapping and selling children. In typical fashion, Georgia and her attorney claimed that she hadn't ousted from the league, but had voluntarily withdrawn because of many of their attitudes which were not in agreement. Georgia further commercialized children by making them perform, sit on that man's lap, and call him daddy, she told one little girl. She also demeaned children by excessively catering to her clients, giving children to some adults who wanted not babies to raise, but objects to give away. I was bought by a couple and given as a gift to my adoptive family, Wilmina Newsom of Memphis told me. My adoptive mother was depressed over the death of her own mother, and instead of buying her a puppy, her friends gave her me. Georgia also debased children by using them as bargaining chips, placing them with politicians and social workers whose oppositions she hoped to diffuse. One of the more blatant instances of such bribery occurred in 1949, when she gave a Tennessee legislator 2 children to prevent his support of reform adoption legislation. Georgia sometimes sent couples 2 or 3 children on trial, allowing them a year to decide which child they wanted to keep. Georgia Tan's attorney frequently referred to children as products. It is not as often that we have the good luck that we have in your case, namely of having the merchandise in hand and in stock to deliver to you immediately, Abe Waldar wrote to one of Georgia's prospective clients in 1944. This is one business in which we can never tell when we can fill an order, he wrote to a less fortunate applicant the same year. In 1947, Abe informed a prospective client that Georgia's adoptive parents had complete custody and control of a child for 1 year, may submit the child to any physical or mental examination they wish, and take any steps they may desire to ascertain they have a healthy and normal child. If it is not, the Tennessee Children's Home takes it back without question. Okay, the way that they're talking about children is utterly disgusting. Let's be real. And Georgia's clients frequently did send children back, often because they appeared less intellectually gifted than the adoptive parents had been led to expect. The pain experienced by rejected children meant nothing to Georgia, as did the suffering of those not returned but resented for falling short. Virginia Simmons said, I was told my adoptive mother ordered me like out of a Sears or Roebuck catalog. When Virginia developed scoliosis, her mother was furious. She said, I spent a lot of money on you, and you're such a disappointment. If I'd known you were going to develop that crooked back, I never would have picked you out. While Georgia informed her clients of her liberal merchandise return policy, she presented her usual false face to the public. In a letter to the editor published in the Press Scimitar in 1938, she castigated in a White Plains, New York couple who were considering returning a severely unintelligent child they had adopted from a New York agency. The law is definite and is quite of an adoption. It's final, she wrote. If the child had been carried through to the point of legal adoption to the adoptive parents, he is their child from that point on. The fact that he is adopted should never even turn into consideration of his problems. Ooh. Oh God, I have mixed feelings on that. Like, the way that they're really talking about these children right now is just really disgusting. If the White Plains couple had borne this child, she continued, they would have had to cope with his handicap. Whatever their solution would have been, it is the answer to their adopted child's problem. The finality of adoption must be upheld, or the whole structure of the institution based as it's upon the concept of that the adoptive parents stand in the place of the birth parents is destroyed. Few other had initiated would have understood the hypocrisy of Georgia's words. But as frequently as her children were returned, Georgia knew that she'd stay in business, that the vast majority of her clients had more scruples than she, and even when disappointed by their adoptive children, would keep them. Perhaps it was this insight into human nature that allowed her to risk customer dissatisfaction by misrepresenting her children in the first place. Falsifying their birth records, she portrayed many as the children of debutantes, 20 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, 120 pounds, blonde, blue-eyed, of English ancestry, was her typical misrepresentation of a birth mother who had been made pregnant by medical students. The young woman's mother was usually a society woman, her father a prominent physician. Clients' expectations of their adoptive children having the intelligence to eventually attend Harvard must have been justified. Georgia was also constantly unreliable in her representations of her baby's religions. Most of her children were born to Protestant young women, but Abe Walder, who was Jewish, had contracts with rabbis across the country, and throughout the 1940s, considerably more than half of her clients were Jewish. They wanted to adopt Jewish babies, so Georgia falsely represented many of her children as Jewish. Some Orthodox Jewish parents were upset to later learn that their children hadn't been born Jewish. Social worker Boo Cravens witnessed the worst consequence of Georgia's lies. Sent from Nashville to Memphis in 1950 to help close the home, Boo received letters from social agencies in every state in which Georgia had sent children, requesting information about their birth parents. Discovering an accurate bit of information among the false ones Georgia had recorded, she communicated it to the New York State Department of Public Welfare. Unknown to her, however, New York law prohibited residents from adopting children of a religion different from their own. Okay, I didn't know that at that time, but that's interesting. Discovering that a boy adopted 16 years earlier by a local Jewish family had been born Protestant, authorities placed him in a foster home. Boo didn't want any more children's lives disrupted. So when agencies inquired about other babies adopted by Jewish couples, we just started lying. Ugh. She and other workers changed the children's birth names to Jewish-sounding surnames. She told me, sounding so kind, so truly concerned, that I tried not to consider how such falsifications heaped upon Georgia's had hopelessly obscured adoptees' true histories. Okay, I want to make this clear that now in 2025, it doesn't matter. Anyone of any religion can adopt. I will say that religion is one aspect you should be concerned about in terms of not really genetic marrying, but like understanding cultural, religious, etc. significance for that child. I would say, and again, I'm going to say that I personally am anti-religion, organized religion, I should say. If you guys are part of an organized religion, cool, nothing against that. I would say just don't force that upon your child, right? Allow them to be allowed to explore. But when you're changing names, right, they're changing these names before the names are changed yet again because of the adoption, right? Let's remember that. So they don't even have their true histories. It's falsification upon falsification. When you change those names, yes, some surnames are religious for a reason. Some are very ethnic, right? We have to remember that. Now, again, we're in 2025. These things still happen to this day. If and when you are adopting or taking in a child not of your own biological, right? Consider not changing their names. Consider honoring their family's religion, their family's culture, their family's ethnicity. Learn about it, educate yourself, especially when you're dealing with a transracial adoptee. that is going to be important, because when you try to force a child to assimilate for your own benefit, you're going to just hurt the child. Assimilation is not the key, in my opinion, right? It just does more harm. All right, we're going to continue on. Georgia's adoptees, of course, cared less about their adopted parents' religions than their characters, and Georgia placed some children with terrible people. She sold 7-year-old Eugene Calhoun to a farmer so vicious that the children's initiation into his new home consisted of watching his adoptive mother spend 3 days dying of food poisoning, all while vainly begging her husband for help. This beginning was portentous. The farmer was just as cruel to Eugene, keeping him ragged, shoeless, in the fields for 18 hours a day, and in an unheated bedroom at night. He beat him with belts and farm tools. He split his spine with a post hole digger. Ooh. Oh. I know today we still see horrible things. I don't understand how these people can get away with such neglect and abuse of children. Okay, and I'm going to make this clear. I frankly don't care if the child is adopted or not adopted. Abuse is abuse, and a child deserves better. Okay? That being said, yes, adoptees are at a higher rate for neglect and abuse. Not just adoptees, foster youth, anyone that is living with a non-biological parent, that includes step-parents, are at higher risks. We have to be real about these situations. Does that make every person evil? Of course not, right? But we have to do better vetting. Sorry, I'm like trying not to cry because this is just horrible. Okay. Decades later, Eugene had surgery to remove bone fragments from his spine, but miraculously, he had escaped paralysis, and at age 16, he escaped the farmer, running away to join the Navy. He later became a printer and a successful, self-taught graphic artist. When I spoke with him in the 1990s, he lived in Farmington, Missouri, and was cherishing his relationship with his long-lost mother, brothers, and sister, with whom he'd recently been reunited through search expert Danny Glad, after a separation of 60 years. Another child adopted through Georgia Tan by a man who had hoped adoption might cure his wife of infertility was left to suffer the consequences of not being curative. Would he be resented if the adoptive mother failed to conceive? Or even being so, would he be treated as inferior to the birth child? I know of this boy only from a letter dated in the 1940s. I don't know what happened to him, but I did speak with people adopted for similarly inappropriate reasons, such as replace a dead birth child. Okay, again, adopting a child does not cure your infertility issues, okay? And I'm gonna say this as nicely as possible. We are not a fucking Band-Aid for your infertility. And I know that wasn't as nice as it probably should have been, but I am tired of this. Infertility is considered a disability, and it sucks. I get it, okay? But children are not commodities, or should not be treated as commodities, and we cannot heal your infertility. I also was adopted for the same reason, okay? Now, yes, I have amazing adoptive parents. Again, they are trauma-informed, and that doesn't negate that they had issues, right? Like I was saying earlier, my mother had a stillborn child, and she still adopted. Okay, I love my adoptive parents. I really do. But we are not Band-Aids for infertility. We should not be praying and I mean the PREYING, also the PRAYING, you guys get the point. Anyway, we should not be praying that that families cannot be preserved for your benefit to adopt. You want to rip apart another family so you can benefit. And yeah, I have seen plenty of people talk about, oh, I adopted a child and then I got pregnant. I know of a couple of people that happened to. I don't think that was done on purpose, but they still adopted because they were having fertility issues. Let's be honest, right? Again, you could be great parents. It doesn't mean that you haven't done harm or that you haven't made mistakes. I cannot go and undo adoptions, nor should I necessarily want to. I think it's completely dependent upon the adoptee, should there ever be a law out there. Okay, I think it's a very personal thing. However, we as a collective whole can continue to use our voices to say infertility sucks, but we as adoptees are not the cure. We're not the Band-Aid, we're not the medicine, we are not the end-all be-all. We are not option 2, okay? We need to stop that shit immediately, expeditiously. And it doesn't just go to infertile couples. This also goes to, LGBTQ couples or couples who are older, right? For whatever reason infertility is, whether it's PCOS or, cancer or something else, right? Because I've also seen individuals not want to pass on their genetics because there's issues within them and could put the child at risk. And again, I totally understand whatever reason it is you don't want to have a biological child or cannot, okay? Again, does not mean you should be hoping a family is torn apart so you can benefit. Because that is not putting the best interests of the child. That is being selfish. And I know that's hard to hear, but that is reality. Okay, sorry, I really went off. Although from her earliest years, Joy Barner knew she disappointed the people who raised her. She didn't know she was being measured against a ghost, or even that she'd been adopted. Placed with an Arkansas couple as a baby, she grew up believing she was their birth and only child. Then at age 7, she opened an old trunk to find a first grade reader inscribed with the name Mary Eleanor, a picture of a beautiful little girl with ringlets, and several tiny dainty dresses. Joy, whose wardrobe was the antithesis of frilly, asked her adoptive mother incredulously, were these mine? No, she shouted. They were your sister's and she's dead. Don't ever mention her again. But there were roughly things like you put on little girls to make them feel partyish, Joy told me. I asked her why I didn't have any dresses like that. She said, because you are plain. Okay, I want you guys to also remember, I talked about a little bit about people's genetics, right? During this time, Georgia made it believe that our biological parents' genetics were horrible, right? That we're these horrible people, that we're never going to live up to these things, right? And again, she tried to make people believe that we're blank slates. And so for adoptive parents to treat a child like that, oh, you're plain, like you're nothing, you know, or maybe you get comments like, you're just like your birth mother, you're going to end up, on drugs or alcohol or prostitute or whatever adoptive parents tend to say, right? Depending on the situation, and usually untrue. it is horrible. Because it's not, first of all, it's not something that we can change. We can't change our genetics. Let's start with that. Number two, if you are a parent, right, in any capacity, if you are taking in a child, you are supposed to love that child, support that child, and provide basic necessities, which includes emotional, mental stability. This is not that. This is mental and emotional abuse. And we don't talk enough about that side of abuse. People really think that abuse has to be physical or maybe verbal, but even then it gets dicey, right? Like you really have to prove it. But there are other forms of abuse. Medical, right? Educational, mental. Again, not something that we often talk about within society. Okay. That she was not only a less than adequate replacement, but an adopted one was implied throughout her childhood, always in ways that caused pain. When she was 14, her mother took her to a beauty salon for a permanent wave. Joy loved it, but when they returned home, her adopter flew into a rage. "What are you trying to do?" he asked his wife. "Make a whore out of her like her mother?" Didn't I just say that adoptive parents say things like that? Lonely, unloved, Joy cherished her school friends, but her adoptive parents seldom let her socialize. At age 15, she requested permission to attend a picnic with a male classmate. A doubly risky request, for the boy was Jewish and her father was anti-Semitic. "What's his nickname? Isn't it Jaime?" her father shouted. "He's a Jew." No, he's not," begged Joy. Picking up a glass of iced tea, he flung the contents in her face. "If I say he's a Jew, he's a Jew," he said. When Joy was 17, she fell in love with another school friend, Jake, who wasn't Jewish, but her father wouldn't allow her to see him either. So on Valentine's Day, 1939, she and Jake drove to Little Rock, Arkansas, were married, and then returned separately to their parents' homes. Joy hoped to keep her secret from her parents, but she confided in a girlfriend. When she returned home from school several days later, her father screamed that he would have the marriage annulled. "Then I'll just remarry him again." Red-faced, the veins in his neck throbbing, he dragged her to the steel box in which he kept the family's important papers. "You were a mistake," he said. "I want you to know I paid $500 for you, and I could have gotten a good hunting dog for a lot less. You come from the lowest scum on earth." Again, we're talking 1939, and this stuff is still happening. No one deserves to be treated like that. And to compare a child to a dog, when the laws, right, and I'm saying this matter of factly, like you can Google it, okay, the man who created the ASPCA put laws, helped create laws against animal abuse in the 1880s, and the people that were trying to do it for child abuse needed his help. So yes, there are more laws and laws in place longer than for child abuse. That is ridiculous. And don't get me wrong, I love animals, and I'm all for having laws in place to protect animals. But the fact that children are treated worse than animals, and yet technically our animals, our pets, are by law property. Again, they are not human beings. They are beings, right? They are alive. But the fact that children don't get the same, if not better, is disgusting in my opinion. Okay. Joy began to cry. Don't bother to cry. That's what you come from. He threw her adoption papers at her feet. Now don't go looking for your people, he said. Don't open Pandora's box. Her adoptive mother watched, uncomplaining, as he said this. Okay, I'm sorry. As a mother, I would be fighting like hell to protect my child, but I am assuming that this father, no, okay, let me phrase this nicely. Knowing, especially during the times, and I'm sure there were exceptions to this, right? But that women weren't allowed to really speak out, right? It's a very patriarchal, misogynistic world. And on top of that, this parent sounds very abusive. He could have been abusing the mom, and she was probably afraid to speak out. Does that make it right? No. No. She should have stood up and protected her child. And yes, Joy never should have been treated like this at all. Joy ran away to the home of Jake's parents, and when he joined the service shortly afterward, moved with him to Florida and then to Augusta, Georgia. Theirs was a wonderful marriage, which, when I spoke with her, had endured for over 60 years. During the first years after leaving her adoptive home, Joy tried to ignore what her father had said about her birth family. I locked it up, she told me. I closed the door. She bore 2 wonderful sons, built a life so strong that the news that her adoptive grandfather had left money to every grandchild but her couldn't touch it. I have what I've worked for, she told herself, not what somebody gave me. But she couldn't help wondering about her parents and her older brother, Grady, whose name had been listed in her adoption papers. On June 12th, 1943, she had written to Georgia Tan. I was brought up completely unaware of the fact that I was an adopted child. When I married a year ago, this past February, they told me that I wasn't their child. They told me that I was the child of riverboat trash who gave me away because they didn't want me. Several months ago, I wrote to the juvenile court seeking information of my parents or brother. I received an answer from the chief probation officer, F.E. Bradley, advising me to contact you. He said you were the only person who could give me the desired information. Miss Tan, surely there is some information you can give me concerning my parents or my brother Grady. It is very confusing to suddenly realize that you have parents and a brother you've never known. You are the only person who can help me, Miss Tan, and I beg of you to give me any information you can that will help me to find my people. Georgia never answered. Joy's attempts to obtain information through the Tennessee Department of Social Services produced no results. And whenever her sons misbehaved, she reasoned that her past might be a box best left closed. But when Grady, who after years of effort had obtained a court order releasing his adoption records, contacted her in 1989, she discovered her genealogy to be no cause of shame. Her parents had been poor and her father an alcoholic, but he and her mother had loved her, and after she and Grady were stolen from their houseboat in 1925, visited Georgia Tan and juvenile court judge Camille Kelly, begging for their return. They were accompanied by other relatives, the children's uncles and cousins and maternal grandmother Nevada, who never gave up hope of reunion with her grandchildren. She and the children's parents had sent Georgia Tan letters protesting the children's abduction for 25 years until Georgia died. When Joy learned that her own name had originally been Nevada after her grandmother, she felt a connection she never felt before. Okay, pausing there. This is what we mean by names have meanings, right? And I've seen as an adult, a lot of adoptees are now changing their names back to their birth name. And I think this is a very personal choice, right? I think it's very wonderful that these adoptees are able to do that. I think it's wonderful when adoptive parents honor biological parents. I'm going to say this. I'm not going to change my name. Won't even change my last name, even though it's my adoptive parents. But I say that because I wasn't given a name. My birth mother allowed my adoptive parents to give me a name. And in doing so, they honored her by giving me her middle name. Well, they shortened it, but so my middle name is in honor of her. And I then named my son, his middle name is a mix between honoring my birth mom, myself, and one of my great-grandparents. So it's like, even though it's a specific name, it kind of honors all three of us. My one of my grandmothers thought that my mother named me after that particular grandfather because of my middle name, but also my grandfather. And my mom had to lie to her and say, yeah, that was it, because of the way that she was, and the way that he was. My grandfather, my adoptive mom's dad, my bad, was not really the best father in the world. However, his father was an amazing person. So, you know, you can still honor people, right? There's a lot of different ways to do so. Now, I also say that I will never change my name, even if I were to get married, because I have created a legacy, in my opinion. I've had my success in my name, including in my last name, right? And while for the longest time I desperately wanted to change my name, right? Couldn't wait to get married, couldn't wait to have children and change my name and all that. As the years went on, I realized that this name that I have, right, was, yes, it was given to me by my adoptive parents, but it's what I made of it. Now, I am not telling any adoptee to do that. If you don't feel a connection to your name, change it, okay? I support that. I'm just saying that there's different sides of this. And for adoptive parents out there, honor the biological parents. If they have a name, keep it. If they later want to change their name or add on to your name, right, then let it be. A great example of this is, sorry, we're going into history here, is, oh God, what's his name? Spencer Phipps, okay? We're talking the 1690s. He was adopted by Sir Governor William Phipps and his wife. Now, it was a kinship. It was her nephew that they took in. I don't know the full reason. I don't know what happened to his parents. I'll be honest with you. I'm still deep diving. But she was infertile. So this is before even the country was, the USA wasn't even a full country. There were no laws on the books. Anyway. And it wasn't until he was older, I think between the ages of 16 to 18, that he decided to change his name to take on their last name. And that was a very personal choice, right? But I use that as an example because, again, it was his choice. The entire time he went by his original last name, even though he was adopted. And they honored it. Again, it was also a kinship, but there is also the aspect that the adoptive mom, again, I can't remember her name off the top of my head, was infertile. So again, there's still issues within that, but yeah. All right. She was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian, Joy told me. Now I know where I get my strong features. She acted as a midwife when I was born in a 2-room log cabin in the bank of the Sunflower River in Mississippi. Joy, who'd long painted miniature scenes on china, had, when I last spoke with her by phone, just finished her first oil painting, a portrait of her grandmother, Nevada. I wish you could see it, she said. I painted her with her black hair and high cheekbones, looking strong. I would have enjoyed growing up near her. As is the case of most people strong enough to survive their difficulties, Joy didn't spend an inordinate amount of time regretting something she would never have, preferring to enjoy what she could, the most important of which was spending every possible minute with her brother Grady, who was ill. She was extremely proud of him, for though he'd had a difficult childhood, experiencing several foster and adoptive placements before finding a permanent adoptive home, he hadn't become bitter. He is a good person, she said. It was an unsurprising testimonial, given not only the fact of its truth, but her joy at having been found by Grady after a separation of 64 years. Brothers and sisters reunited after many years don't take their relationship for granted. This was illustrated not only by Joy Barner, but by adoptee Barbara Davidson, who in the 1990s told me of her reunion with her sister, whose childhood name was Mary. Barbara's account seemed particularly moving within the context of the suffering they'd shared while in George's custody and their agonized separation. Subjects so painful 50 years after their reoccurrence that Barbara related them, not in linear fashion, but in stream of consciousness bursts. It was a horrendous thing that Georgia did, and only God can help her. I don't know if God can help her. Barbara was talking, I realized, not only of Georgia's cruelty in parting her from Mary, but in sexually abusing both girls while they were in her custody. Several people had informed me of Georgia's sexual abuse of children among the mail I received in response to my Good Housekeeping article. On Georgia Tann had been a letter from a 54-year-old man who later told me and another reporter about the abuse he and his twin brother had suffered in Memphis in the 1940s. The twins had been less than 8 years old. We remember being in a big bed, stripped naked. Georgia Tann and some other people were there reaching for us and kissing us and touching us where we shouldn't be touched, one brother told a reporter for the Daily Pantograph. Gosh, this is so disgusting. We've talked about this. These people never, the children never got justice, right? The adults that are failing these children were never convicted for their crimes. Taken from their mother at age 5, the twins had been placed in the Tennessee Children's Home Society Orphanage in Nashville, and then sent to a California adoptive couple. The adoptive mother frequently beat them, often with a cord from an electric iron. The boys ran away, were found and sent to Memphis, where they were put in the Porter Home and Leith Orphanage. The twins later saw a page of its record book that read, "Miss Tann wants these twin boys to have institutional training before being adopted again." Like other residents, they were viewed every Sunday by prospective adoptive parents, and they were eventually selected by a kind farming couple. But haunted by the memories of the separation from their mother, they searched for and in 1987 found her and their 2 sisters. It was a happy reunion, but did not fully satisfy their need for connection to their past. When I last spoke with them, they were hoping to write a book about their experience with Georgia Tann. Barbara Davidson and her older sister Mary were abandoned by their mother to Georgia Tann in 1942 and housed in an orphanage that Georgia visited frequently. Raised until the ages of 5 and 7 by an alcoholic mother so neglectful they had to rummage through neighbors' garbage cans for food, Barbara and Mary had always been close. Their devotion intensified when they entered Georgia Tann's custody. Mary was all I had, Barbara said. She slept near me at night, but it was still frightening. The beds creaked and the floors were cold, so cold, and I would cry for a blanket, but no one would give me a blanket. Okay, pausing there. Let's remember that actually being abandoned was quite rare. But I do want to make it clear that these children still deserved better. Their biological mother should never have been an alcoholic and should have been caring for them. They deserved safety. They deserved food. None of that means that they should have been mistreated. Let me make that clear, okay? So in this instance, I would have recommended that they had been removed from their biological mother and sent to a safer situation. Kinship, more likely. And I say more likely because we don't really know. But that being said, this orphanage, right, any orphanage, should not feel so, how do I explain, like so cold and impersonal and so depressing, not just for the adults who are coming in to see these children, right? Because we all say, or not we all, but a lot of people are like, oh, you wouldn't want to be in an orphanage, right? Of course not. No, who would? But at the same time, do the children in orphanages not deserve basic humanity? Right? I mean, the same goes for foster care. The same goes for any child. Rules were strict at the orphanage, Barbara told me, and the punishments were illogically applied. Children were denied access to bathrooms at night, but were beaten for wetting their beds. Mary was beaten twice most evenings, once as a warning and later as punishment. She and other malefactors, children attempting to sneak a drink of water, were caught by women and occasionally men. I remember them patrolling, checking our beds, shining a light in our faces. They carried big black flashlights, Barbara told me, nervously. One night a woman pulled me out of bed by the hair and beat me. She said I stole a lemon gumdrop, and I said I didn't do it. Mary said I didn't either, but the woman hit me in the head and hung me in a closet. Locking residents in closets, I would learn from many other adoptees, was the staff's most frequently used punishment. Barbara and other children were bound with rope around their wrists and suspended by the ropes from coat racks. Oh my God, this is literally torture. I'm sorry, I'm so... This is literally torture. They're literally torturing these children. Their feet barely touching the floor. It was while she was bound, Barbara said, that Georgia Tan molested her. She ran her hands all over me and played with me, that stuff. She said if I cried out, she'd hit me in the head. Georgia Tan assaulted Barbara's sister, Mary, in the closet also, that in a bathroom once, using a wooden spoon. She squatted over me, gouging me, Mary said. She seemed like a giant. She was sadistic, evil. I thought of her as the devil. Another adoptee was 5 years old when assaulted by Georgia in a bedroom. Yes, sexual abuse at the hands of Georgia Tan was very true, and it was presented as your favor, she said. She recalled the bedroom in which she was assaulted as frilly. A gorgeous room. I remember the shock of the room, so overwhelming and beautiful. I remember being told to come sit in her lap. I keep trying to block it all out, but it keeps coming. It caused me a lot of problems you won't find, she said. A whole lot of healthy adults who went through there. And who wants a dog? Because he's driving me crazy. Just kidding. Love the boy, but my God. Trying to record this and he's driving me crazy. Yeah, I'm looking at you, sir. Okay, anyway. I keep trying to block it all out, but it keeps coming. It caused me a lot of problems you won't find, she said. A whole lot of healthy adults who went through there. The objects of George's molestation were little girls were sorry. The objects of George's molestation were little girls, but boys in her custody also suffered abuse, usually from male caretakers. Since I spoke with a relatively small percentage of victims, I was unable to determine the incidence of abuse, but it seemed high. Judging from his own experience, one adoptee said matter-of-factly, "Back then, every boy in an orphanage got molested. I don't really know if Georgia Tan's children suffered more molestation than they would have than in any children's institution. But if Georgia had not stolen many of them, they would not have been institutionalized." Residents of orphanages and reformatories have always been vulnerable to pedophiles, and while offenders are still too seldom punished, there is at least recognition today of the existence of child sexual abuse. Such awareness was lacking during the 26 years of Georgia's operation in Memphis. People didn't talk about child physical or sexual abuse. It was in the closet all over the nation. A physician told me this, a man I greatly respected for having tried diligently but futilely to stop Georgia in the 1940s. Like many elderly Memphians, he asked me not to use his name in this book, and refused to discuss why he had, since the 1970s, worked with abused children. Perhaps he was unaware that he couldn't prevent it in the 1940s had motivated him since then. It's possible it had not, but he spoke eloquently on the subject of mistreated children, telling me that until the publication of a publication in 1961 of a study titled The Battered Child Syndrome. Hold on, I'm going to make sure that we get that. Which he described as a sensation. It woke us all up. Physicians assumed that the children they saw whose bones repeatedly broke were simply clumsy. There was even less awareness, the Memphis doctor said, of sexual abuse than physical abuse of children. And if there was little general recognition of such abuse, I thought, there would be even less among citizens trained by Crump not to notice anything at all. Dr. Clifton Woolley, another pediatrician who was more courageous than the average Memphian of the 1940s, told me of his attempt to obtain help for a year-old baby whose arm had been broken by his mother. It was swollen in the middle of the shaft, between the wrist and the elbow. The mother's neighbor told me the mother had broken the child's arm because he wouldn't eat his pablum. I went to the juvenile court, the police department, every agency I could think of. I could get no one to look into the case. I could get no one to pay attention. Things were really lax in those days. When I asked him if he believed Memphis authorities would be even more reluctant to investigate a woman who, unlike the abusive mother, was known to have Crump's protection, he assented. That greater laxity I determined from speaking with adoptees who, while in Georgia Tan's custody, were physically or sexually abused in orphanages, foster homes, and adoptive homes, was extended to any adult with whom she dealt. Judging from descriptions of their boldness, they were all aware of their immunity to punishment. So again, it's like a, she's kind of like the queen pin, right? Like a mafia. This circle, she has this power and her lackeys, right? I saw this dog is pissing me off right now. I saw with my own two eyes. I'm gonna pause until he stops barking. All right, guys, we are back. No dog around me, so we're gonna get back started. I saw it with my own two eyes, no doubt about that. Attendants, yard guys, taking boys out into the woods. That was just everyday, normal activity. We thought that was life. I must have betrayed some shock, for the man who said this asked, "What are you doing? Living in the Dark Ages?" His name was Randall Gookin, and he lived in Senatobia, Mississippi. The sense of self he communicated through the phone lines, one I would have found strong in any person, seemed particularly remarkable once I had learned of his past. Born in Memphis to irresponsible parents in 1937, he was cared for by his grandparents until age 4, when his grandmother died, and his grandfather married a woman who refused to raise him. Okay, I'm sorry, quick pause. So, something happened with his parents. We don't really know what happened, right? He went into kinship care with his grandparents. That happens quite often. But the step-grandmother didn't want to raise him. I'm not sorry for saying this. What the fuck? Like, I could never be with a partner in life, whether that's a man or a woman, who would not want to step up and help raise my child or my grandchildren or whoever I have in my custody. Nor would I be that type of person if I was in that situation, right? I would always take that child in and love them as if it's my own. That doesn't mean I'm going to lie to them. It doesn't mean I'm replacing the parent, right? We have to honor the biological side, but I would never want to be like, "Oh, I'm now with your grandpa, or I'm now with your dad, and I'm just not going to raise you." Absolutely not. Abso-fucking-lutely not. I find that utterly disgusting. Not only that a woman, right? A woman would say this, but for the grandfather or anyone raising a child to be like, "Yeah, okay, whatever." I have no words. Anyway, we're going to continue on. His grandfather took him to Georgia Tann, who boarded him at the Tennessee orphanage. It was there that he witnessed the abuse he described to me. Like many of the men who spoke of such things, he said that he himself hadn't been abused. The reason wasn't what I heard most frequently, that he fought too hard. But because of my nature, I was rowdy, damn it, mean and ugly. I'm a hare lip. I have a cleft palate. I was the ugly duckling of the family and the ugly duckling of the orphanage. Oh, but I had pictures taken of me lots of times. It ain't nothing. Pictures in which you were dressed or undressed? I asked. Both, yeah, sure. We all had a pose. Somebody would line us up naked or pose us in the shower. I am utterly disgusted. We are talking about children being sexually abused. We are talking about pedophilia. We are talking about human trafficking, child trafficking, right? This is such a hard book to read, even to you guys. And I know that I'm giving my commentary, but like, the fact that no adult, right? All of these adults are failing these children. And granted, this was back in the 40s, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. I want to cry. I want to cry thinking about what these children went through. I cry about, and yeah, I have a sensitive soul. I cry about what children go through now, right? What these children must have gone through, and they're saying, "Oh, it's no big deal." No, none of this should have been happening. None of it. This is why when we say protect the children, we mean protect the children. The adults need to be the responsible ones. The adults need to clock in and report these things. If you see something, say something. That's it. Right? But we have people who are hiding lists like the Epstein files where children were sexually abused. Right? I know that we're talking about now versus then, but same shit is still happening. That is the problem. Okay, sorry. My outrage is a little out of control right now.
The physical features he believed spared him from outright rape may also have prevented his being sold by Georgia Tann. But like other children in her custody, he was subject to what he called inspections. People would come in and look at us like we were dad-burned animals in the zoo. A lot of times we were told, "We want you to meet someone. We may have a new mama and papa, and we want to see how you get along." I heard that too many damn times. I got sick of it. This is kind of like giving, what's that movie? Meet the Robinsons, when the boys were constantly meeting these couples to hopefully be adopted. And then Wilbur, right on the roof, had etched in how many families, and it was like 150. And Wilbur even said the same thing. Of course, nobody never wanted me, right? And this is what these children not only went through, but this is still happening with the idea of like Wednesday's Child, or putting these children on news things, or they have like, like events where they have foster children who are in the throes of available for adoption, where they meet families. Like, I've heard some people talk about, oh, they met their new family at a state, like a football stadium or something, and it's like, yeah, it was at one of these events. Like, do you not realize how sickening that is? Like, first of all, I understand that from foster to adopt is completely different than private infant adoption. Make that clear, okay? Both are pretty bad. But it's literally shopping for a child. Oh no, this one's not good enough. This one has a physical disability. We're not going to do this. We're going to pass, right? Or the rehoming, right? Children got rehomed, and it still happens. I believe it's about 7 out of 10 adoptees end up getting rehomed. People think that just because we're adopted, right, that it means that we'll never be in foster care, or that we'll never return to foster care, which is completely inaccurate. All right, continuing on. Bear in mind, though, when you get old enough to work, then people want you. They'd say, "Oh, you're a strong little fella." He served in 9 different homes, beginning when he was 8. I waxed floors, washed dishes, vacuumed, mowed lawns, fed the cows, cleaned out the barns. I was a little servant. No one ever came to check on me. I was beat with rose bushes, rubber hoses, razor strops, 2x4s. The birth children in the foster homes were often as cruel as their parents. They'd say, "You're not our brother. You're just here to work, and we don't have to." Sorry, this is sickening. I was with one family that had a truck patch out on James Road during tomato time. Their boys and I were supposed to pick tomatoes. They wouldn't work, and I had to fill up their baskets. I got mad and threw a whole bunch of tomatoes at them. Ruined them. And their father beat me with a garden hose, I said. "I'll fix him," and unhitched the trailer of tomatoes so it rolled down the road and turned over and squashed everything. And he beat me again, and I ran away. Okay, I want to go back to the moment where he said, they'd say, "You're not our brother." This is often what we hear, not only in, and I'm not going to say it's my personal experience, but this is what I've heard other people say who have siblings that they're biologically related to the parents, and it could even be like we're the adopted ones and we meet our biological family, where it's like this disconnect. And we often hear this from non-triad members, right? People that have no lived experience, where it's like, oh yeah, you're just like, why would you want to search for them? They're not really your family. They're not your real family, right? But then when we're in our quote unquote real family, we get treated the same, right? Or it's not always that case. Or I hate the word real, so I'm going to say our fake family, our paper family, as some people refer to them. They treat us they can treat us horribly, and it's like they act like we're not really part of the family. Now, I got extremely lucky as an adoptee where in the actual home that I've lived in, my brother, who's also adopted, and I are fairly close, even though we're 15 years apart. However, my biological siblings, which I have 3 of, half siblings, 2 older, 1 younger, we're all in our 30s, and none of them actually know I exist. And I have a feeling it would pretty much be the same of this treatment, right? I have reached out and I've gotten no response, and I've had to come to terms with that. That's a whole big thing. But I've heard these stories, and it's just, it's maddening. And then when we try to explain to non-triad members how hurtful this all is, this treatment, there have been adoptees who equate adoption to slavery. I don't know if I would be one of those, but I've heard so many disgusting stories of how, kind of like a Cinderella, right? Like you're forced to work, right? You're forced to clean, you're forced to do all these things and be that servant, when the fairy tale is you are supposed to be treated like a precious gift, right? But that's not the truth. Okay. Continuing on. He was caught, however, sent back to Georgia Tan, replaced and placed again until he ran away for good at 15. His grandfather got him a job in construction, which he kept for 9 years. Visiting an uncle at age 16, he fell in love with a girl from a nearby farm. They married 3 years later, and when I spoke with him, he and his wife had recently celebrated their 36th wedding anniversary. His years in an orphanage and foster care had, he said, left 2 marks, one of which he considered a realistic, and some might consider unduly pessimistic view of the foster care system. I mean, I think majority have a bad view of foster care. Anyway, he was sure that children in foster care in the 1990s were being treated as badly as he was. And they were. And they are. Just saying. The only ones that I see who have a positive view of foster care are those that are in the fog, and it's usually CPS workers that are working for the system. I have heard a lot of former CPS workers say that it's pretty bad. We often hear, like, oh, you don't want your kid to go to foster care, right? Like, it's so bad. And yes, but then we also hear those same people put down foster kids, right? Because of the trauma. And it's like, they put such a negative spin on it, and it's like, you got to realize these kids are going through so much trauma, and being a foster parent, I'm sure, is not easy, and I'm sure they're being lied to about what the parents are doing, and there's just a lot of lies going around, and mistreatment. There's some really great foster parents as well who are going above and beyond, and that's great. We love to hear that. But I would first believe a child that is going through the system than I would any adult who never went through it, right? If I hear a foster parent complain about a foster child, right, but I hear that child say, hey, I'm being abused, I'm going to believe that child. I'd rather be wrong and believe that child and put that child first than ignore it and allow that child to continue to be abused. You see what I'm saying? Anyway, when I ventured that conditions might have improved, he said, as if in a pity. You don't know nothing. People don't take these kids because they love them. There ought to be a way to put little cameras on foster kids and see what really happens to them. Ooh. Yeah. I'm not against that. I will say CPS workers are overworked, and there definitely needs to be a better system of, are children actually being abused, or is there something with poverty? What resources can we bring in, especially as we're going through this political era where we're getting more people are going into poverty, more people are getting less resources and in need of resources because of government shutdown, right? There's going to be more cases like this. How do we help out, right? Instead of removing the child, which according to the NCFA, 63% of children are removed due to poverty, not actual neglect. There's got to be a better system, right? There has to. And, the other day on my personal Facebook, I saw something and it said, poverty is not the failure of the individual, but the failure of the government. And I was like, oh, hell yeah. Like, there is just so much, right? Like, there's no perfect government. Let's be clear about that. There is going to be people struggling in every country. We know that on different levels, right? Because equity and equality are not the same thing. However, and I say a big however, we have seen in our own country, in the United States, that more resources are given under Democratic presidents than Republicans. And in fact, this is one of the lowest in recent decades that our country has ever experienced. There are government workers going to food banks. There are government workers suffering. They're not getting paid. This includes soldiers. Like, what are we doing? All right. Continuing on. Well, I told him I understand one legacy of having been involved with Georgia. What's the other? His laugh rang through my phone's earpiece. Strength. He must have sensed my skepticism because he chuckled again. You have no... He started over with the patience. Could you believe me if I told you that being raised in an ugly duckling world and being punished and made to work like a slave made a person out of me? It gave me a lot of determination to fight and do better for myself. I think I learned a lot. I sure as hell don't think kids should be mistreated, but it made me independent, made me work for what I want. Okay, let me say this. I hear this often, that someone having gone through a traumatic experience, right, that it gave them, helped them become determined, helped them become hardworking and overcome a lot, and gave them strength and gave them a different or a better personality. I don't think any child should have to experience that to become what I would consider the quote-unquote true selves, right? You can get there without all of this, okay? We could talk about passion. What are you passionate about? What are you going through? What are your steps? There are ways to get there without the trauma. You can be a strong person without the trauma. Again, it just makes me sad for those that think this. I had heard other similar protestations, what I'd always considered rationalizations, from other adoptees. One man appended a description of his punishment for refusing to eat breakfast in a Tennessee orphanage. I got 5 right across the face with, "You might think it was brutal, but it got my attention." I choked the food down. He strains to persuade himself, I thought, that his suffering had meaning. I was inclined to think this too of Randall Gookin. But his tone almost convinced me of his words, that suffering could fortify a person had always seemed implausible, but I wanted to believe it. I recorded with more than usual care what he offered as proof of how strong his fires had forged him. I traveled around a lot on my first job, but when the kids were old enough for school, I promised my wife we'll settle in one place. In 1962, I bought 60 acres in Senatobia, farmed them, and also began working in a factory. I've been supervisor now in 3 different ones. I have 2 of the most wonderful daughters in the world. They're grown and settled now, but they live to come home. I have a wonderful wife, 4 beautiful grandkids, a family. We're closer than close as dirt is to the earth. The next time I heard from Billy Hale, I couldn't help contrasting his situation with Randall Gookin's. Billy was lonely, I knew, in his trailer and at work, renovating a mansion for a friend who was usually away on business. But he was making efforts both to connect with his old world and make a new life. He spoke frequently with his adult children and was thinking of buying some land near Kingsport and building a house. He had run an ad in the personals column and made dates with 3 women. He was accepting, finally, that his mother Molly was dead and was searching for something constructive to do with his memories of pain and loss. He sent me poems with such titles as The Closet, Who Am I? And Why Me, Lord? Several had been published in an anthology. It didn't seem to be enough, but now, he told me with enthusiasm, he hadn't evinced before. He was writing an article about his abduction and molestation for the Missing Children's Bulletin, which is published by the Missing Children's Locate Center. In that his story concerned, he wrote, not the stereotypical type of slime that lurks around playgrounds and public toilets, waiting for the chance to steal and rape children, but a woman of some standing in her community. And that such supposedly respectable molesters still operate today. His tale would serve, he hoped, as caution, cautious of his duty as reporter. He had planned to write dispassionately, but from the beginning he risked the first person. My biggest fear, he wrote, was being murdered. That is heavy but true. We still have this, right? And it's still coming to light. As I was talking a little bit earlier in this video, we still have the Epstein files. We don't know who was on that list. A lot of these people that are supposedly on this list or had connections with Epstein are supposedly people in power, upstanding people, actors, singers, authors, politicians, the president, and not just the current president, but other presidents. We have to be real about this, right? So this isn't new. It's still going. All right. The worst abuse occurred in a boarding home to which Georgia Tann sent him upon his arrival in Memphis. Billy didn't know the location of the house, but judging from the frequency with Georgia visited, he believed it was near her home on Poplar Avenue. It has 12 children and was owned by a thin woman with white hair. A handy man lived in the basement. He was big-boned and wore overalls and smoked constantly. His name was Peterson, Billy recalled. The other children warned Billy to stay away from Peterson, and he hoped to, but when he was playing in the yard several days later, he fell into a puddle, and the white-haired lady told him to stay on the porch until he dried. Underneath the porch was an entrance leading to the basement, and Peterson came out and up to Billy. Come with me, he said. Billy tried to dodge his big hands, but the man got him and carried him to the basement. Decades later, Billy could still see the room. A washing machine stood against one wall, a furnace against another. Behind the furnace was a door. The man unlocked it and pushed it open. The room was small and dark. The bed sheets were dirty, and he laid Billy on them, and he unbuttoned his overalls. "Don't you cry," he told Billy. "I'll kill you if you do." This was the first of dozens of rapes that so tore Billy's flesh that by the time he was adopted a year later, he was at times incontinent. He was eventually forced to undergo surgical repair. Ooh, I'm sorry, guys. This is so heavy. When I tell you reading this together with you is important, I mean it. Billy tried to explain how he bore the abuse. "In my head, I built a safe room. It had thick walls and no windows and big locks on the door. I went in there whenever he touched me, and it was like I couldn't feel, like I was just watching a movie involving some other boy." Okay, so our brains protect ourselves by shutting out the horridness. A lot of times we black out the memories. And I believe earlier in this chapter, in earlier chapters, that's what Billy was talking about, like not wanting to remember these things. And I was talking about this with my book club too, right? We were not necessarily talking about children, but we were talking about PTSD specifically, right? Especially in veterans. And how a lot of veterans, if they don't, it was kind of more of a wonder. If veterans don't talk about what happened, if they don't seek the help after they've come through whatever it was, traumatic, war, etc., right? It doesn't have to be war to get PTSD, but we were talking more about World War II and Vietnam. That later in life, on their deathbeds, right, that it will come back up, and it's reliving those moments, right? Our brain kind of clicks back to those moments to release them. And so that's my wonder, if this will end up helping Billy and healing by him talking about it. Okay. For the rest of his life, Billy had stored his painful memories of his mother Molly, of being stolen and hurt, in the safe room. Only recently had he considered letting them out, and he'd reached the decision by default. Through realizing that despite his locks, they had been seeping through cracks, provoking rages and behaviors unworthy of Molly's son. He had related his past to the members of his survivor of sex abuse support group. "I've drained them all the help they can give me." Maybe, I believe, he was thinking now of his newsletter article. "It's my turn to help." Through the centuries, there have been countless adults who have abused children, but there are apparently only so many abusive techniques. I realized the archetypal nature of certain punishments before I began my Georgia Tan project, after Good Keeping published an article I'd written about a young girl who had survived and what could well have been a fatal abuse. As was often the case when I wrote about people who had suffered hardship, reader response was considerable. Elderly nuns wrote that they had prayed all night for the girl, and several readers sent news clips regarding children in their area who had recently been abused. Reading, I was struck by the similarities between their torture and that of the subject of my story. So many of them had been burned, as had she, by cigarettes and scalding water, iron stove coils. Some had almost been drowned. They had been starved and imprisoned in bedrooms, basements, closets. They had been tethered to sinks, bedposts, railings. They were forced to stand naked outside in the snow. They had been punished for bedwetting, sneaking food, and most frequently, general badness, the exact nature of which was so seldom specified they must have believed it was in their very being. As a result of their torture, many had died. And this still continues if you just look at the news. And maybe it's because I often get articles that have specific to foster care and adoptees. even before I was an adoption educator, we would hear these stories, right? But I didn't pay attention to how often it was a foster parent or a step parent or an adoptive parent or, kinship even, right? Like, and now that I'm continue to educate you guys, but as well as myself, I see it all the time, and I'm just, it's just so maddening. It's sad. It's, if I could make a magical wish, I would wish that none of this would happen, right? That people would be understanding and loving and empathy, but that's not the case. To say life isn't perfect is not even an inkling of what is happening, right? Nobody's life is perfect. But nobody, child or adult, should be abused. The difference is that a child cannot walk away. An adult has more opportunities to, right? Children rely on the adults. And there lies the problem in the abusive nature, right? That these adults continue to do so. Now, not to negate all the harm, because absolutely it's wrong, I do also wonder if some of these adults were also abused as children. And that normalized it. I always wonder that, because you can have one of two things happen, right? And we've seen it in other cases, and TV shows talk about it too. You can have something happen in a home and have two very different outcomes, right? I remember, I believe it was a Criminal Minds episode, but it made me think about this, where Shamar Moore's character was sexually abused. And he became their FBI, right? He went the law enforcement route because he wanted justice and he didn't want it to happen to anyone else. Whereas I believe it was his brother or a friend, I forgot the whole episode, but went the opposite route and started doing it to other children. And I'm going to bring this back to myself, like into real life, right? Now, I was not abused as a child. I will say that. I'm very lucky that my adoption actually saved me from that moment. However, my oldest sibling, my older half-brother, was by our father. And although he ended up in kinship care after that, he then did the same. Instead of breaking the cycle, he then continued it. Now, I knew this for the most part, growing up. I knew some, age appropriate. I knew some of the stuff that was happening. I knew that he had been abused. I knew that there were bad things happening. I will say that my parents did a pretty good job about not putting full blame on my dad or my brother, in the sense that, like, they didn't put judgment. Like, it was just the act itself. And of course the act itself is bad, right? No negating that. But they felt like it wasn't their place to judge because that was my biological family. So I appreciate that. But first of all, my biological mother wanted me to not be in that situation. So it's complicated. I've been learning more and more of my own story. It's crazy. Anyway, she was being abused, and she knew this of my brother, and so she reluctantly placed me because she had no support as well. She didn't want me in that situation, and I don't know why she I don't think we even talked about why she didn't try to place me with my grandparents. But anyway, I ended up with strangers who are my parents, love them, but technically they were, they're not biologically related. Whereas my brother ended up with kin, or great-grandparents. I later found out that my brother had went to jail for the same things, or some of the same things, that my father had gone to jail. And we see this in other things like drug addicts and alcoholics. It could be hoarding. It could be a lot of different things. We see it come down the pipeline of being a cycle, right? Knowing some of these things helped me be a cycle breaker. I did not want to be that for myself, let alone for my future children at the time, right? This is kind of the way that my parents set it up for me, and now I've set it up for my son. I've had to explain to him that, hey, like, your grandparents, right, your grandpa on my side was not a good guy. Like, he did some horrific things. And then also to explain that his grandparents on his father's side was an alcoholic, and that his grandmother was a drug addict. Not my mother, my ex's mother. And although he's met them both, because they've both been clean now and things got better for them, there's that whole thing too. Like, my child unfortunately gets it from both sides, right? So his father and I both make it very, very clear that, like, hey, we're breaking cycles here for you. We're not going this route, right? Neither one of us drink. Neither one of us do drugs. Like, we're getting healthy. We're getting clean. We're making sure that we're both cycle breakers. Even though we don't get along, that's a whole different story. We both are breaking cycles from our own family generations, right? And that's important. Anyway, sorry. I got distracted. Okay. I don't know exactly whom Georgia killed other than the 40 to 50 babies who perished in her home during the winter of 1945. 4 more babies and many others mentioned in a letter of complaint written to the Tennessee Department of Public Welfare. The infant, who died 1 week after reaching her New Jersey adoptive home, premature twins taken too early from the hospital, died 1 day after arriving at their boarding home, and the babies left unattended in the broiling sun. It is hard to think of how many must have died. The stories of survivors alone are overwhelming. Of course, it's impossible even to gauge the extent of survivors' suffering. Barbara Davidson, who was molested both by Georgia Tann and her adoptive father, was frequently hit while in George's custody. The woman hit us on the scalp so no one could see the bruises, she told me. She was so traumatized by this that as an adult, she had to be anesthetized to undergo simple procedures like teeth cleaning. She and other adoptees who'd been locked in closets suffered from claustrophobia. And over during my research, I spoke with adoptees who were afraid to immerse their heads underwater or to sit in bathtubs. Legacies of bathing methods used in a Memphis orphanage Georgia sent them to. Joe Pannell told me of witnessing one of these techniques in 1945 when he was 10. Some of the workers had a bad habit of ducking kids underwater and holding them down, he said. Younger children were the workers' most frequent targets, so Joe and other 10-year-old orphanage residents, whose younger sister was also a resident, frequently monitored the little girls' baths. Okay, while I would normally say it's a little bit inappropriate by age, they were doing it out of protection, and for that I can understand, right? They knew that the children are more responsible and more caring about other children than grown adults. They have more respect and strength than these adults will ever have. The fact that these children had to grow up so fast, right? Sometimes people call young children who go through such trauma old souls, which at first when I was a kid, I've been called that. And at first I was like, yeah, like, I'm an old soul. Like, I just resonate better with, like, certain people. Learning so much more that it's about having to grow up faster or, like, feeling that need. Like, I never wanted to be a kid. I always wanted to be grown up. Like, I couldn't wait to be a teenager. I couldn't wait to drive. I couldn't wait to go to college, yada, 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 right? Like, always dreaming of the future and, believe it or not, leaving the house. Living not anywhere near where I do now, which is such a difference. But, oh God, it's crazy to think. Anyway, it's about growing up and, like, yeah, these kids had to do what the grown-ups should have been doing. One day, we saw a woman holding Gus's sister, Barbara Jean, underwater, Joe told me. He and Gus shoved the woman and grabbed the little girl. She was just about drowned, Joe said. Years after the rescue, he and Barbara Jean married. Speaking with Joe on a day when other interviewees had told me terribly sad stories, I felt revived, more so than justified. Yet the fortification I took from speaking with him helped me perceive how the next adoptee I spoke with, who was as troubled as any I knew, managed to keep going. The bathtubs were some of the most frightening things, Barbara Davidson said. We'd have to stand in the hallway, naked, boys and girls together. Stand in a straight line, the woman in front would say, and we'd be shaking, seeing the steam coming out of the tubs. The water was so hot, scalding. In response to my observation that her caretakers must have been sadistic, she said quickly, I can't believe they enjoyed hurting us. They used the water to keep us in control. She wanted to believe this, wanted to protect herself from realizing she'd been in the hands of people devoid of moral centers. I would have too in her place. However, not having been one of George's victims, I could both applaud Barbara's struggle to keep from falling into the abyss and sense how hard she had to work to avoid it. And Barbara was one of the lucky ones. She had survived. The insight her words provided into the amount of energy she and other adoptees expend each day making sense of repressing the past deepened my appreciation of the truth of what they had believed for decades. Something good must come from this mess. Must come despite the fact that it will never compensate adoptees for the loss of capacity for sexual pleasure occasioned by repeated sexual abuse, or their having been hung from coat racks by ropes tied around their wrists or dangled down laundry chutes. Nothing will assuage the hunger spasms suffered by infants delivered to their adoptive homes, feverish and dehydrated, or by older children who were also underfed while in George's care. During the 2 years that Heidi Naylor spent in George's network, she was fed little but cold oatmeal. When she was adopted at age 7, she had crooked legs caused by rickets and scars on her backs and buttocks from having been whipped with a switch fashioned from a rose bush. 2 of Heidi's younger siblings, Arthur East and Judy Young, who remained in Memphis a year longer than she, were also malnourished. I was so hungry I'd sneak into the kitchen and swipe cabbage and lettuce. It was the only food they didn't lock up, Arthur said. He shared his bounty with 3-year-old Judy, of whom he was particularly protective because of her muteness. Since her first day in George's Tan's custody, the toddler had refused to talk. Even after her adoption with Arthur, she refused to part from him, so that the couple from Oxford, Mississippi, who wanted one child, ended up with two. Judy was silent for a year. Barbara Davidson's sister, Mary, was so underfed by some of the foster mothers Georgia Tann placed with her that at age 7, she still fit in a high chair. One boarding mother, angry that Mary had tasted the butter she was churning, made her sit in the high chair for 2 days without eating. Finally, the woman gave her a pail containing mashed potatoes, chicken, biscuits, and gravy and told her to feed it to the dog. Instead, Mary ate the food herself and was beaten. During Joe Pennell's years in a Memphis orphanage, he and other children were frequently put on 2-week-long fasts of bread and water. During that time, we'd be brought into the cafeteria to watch the other children eat, but not be able to eat ourselves. Joe told me, the workers, he said, wanted to demonstrate how cruel they could treat you. Abuse like this makes you know you're a nothing. It makes you a nothing. And that stays with you all your life. That is horrible. And remember, this isn't just the adoptive parents doing this, right? Some of these adoptive parents were also underfeeding and starving these children. These were the orphanages. These were the foster homes. This still happens. Maybe not to the same extent in most of these homes, but a lot of the times they'll lock up the food and they're not supposed to, right? I've unfortunately had to deal with CPS just because stupid people. And they've, looked in my home. The only time I had a lock on anything was, my son was really young at the time, was a small fridge, and it was only because we had chocolate in there. And I just didn't want him getting to that piece. But otherwise, everything else was open, right? We have, I'm privileged. We have multiple freezers. We have pantries. Like, our house has a lot of different foods. We have fruits and veggies. We get everything, a lot of things fresh from the farm. But to lock up food and underfeed the child, right? I've even seen people do this for kids who are obese, right? Who have childhood obesity, and they lock things up, and all you're doing is making it so that they're hiding stuff instead of teaching them moderation or, helping them learn to eat healthier and work out and things like that. You're causing, either way, right? You're causing an eating disorder. And then we have children who I've heard, were adopted from orphanages, where they later had eating disorders, right? Or had issues with eating, and the adoptive parents would do similar things. They would beat their child because of the way that the child ate. Instead of being like, let's deal with this. Let's treat children like they should be, with respect and love, and consider all of those things. So again, these things still happen. And that is a huge problem. But I'm glad that we are discussing this and Georgia and how awful she is, because this is something that I think a lot of people, or majority of people, should know. Yeah. Okay, continuing on. Another of Georgia's cruelties that will never be assuaged was her callous separation of siblings. Heidi Naylor, who entered Georgia's network at age 5 with 4 siblings, ages 2 to 6, told me that later being separated from them had been more painful than had been any other abuse she suffered while in Georgia Tann's custody. For a time, all 5 children were housed in the same orphanage, but in October of 1948, Heidi and her older sister Virginia were abruptly flown to California. I remember it all, Heidi told me, the plane and the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. She, Virginia, and 3 other children were taken to a hotel room by one of George's workers, Alma Walton. None of the children knew they were going to be adopted. And all of a sudden, with no preliminary, I was taken to an elevator and told I would never see my sister again. That was goodbye to your sister, Alma Walton said. Heidi was taken to the lobby, which was full of waiting adoptive parents. Alma Walton pointed out one couple, and she just nonchalantly said, "Oh, this will be your sister's parents," Heidi told me. Then she pointed to another couple and said, "Oh, they'll be yours." Heidi mourned the loss of her sisters and brother, and when she turned 21, she began looking for them. But the records were as tight as drums, she told a reporter for the Memphis Commercial Appeal in 1980. It was like hitting your head against the brick wall. It took over 30 years, but she eventually reunited with Virginia and the 3 younger siblings, Arthur East, Judy Young, and Susan Trotter. Older siblings of children seized by Georgia Tann were sometimes tortured by grief for decades. Cleveland Pennell was 15 when he lost his 4-year-old sister, Shirley Ann. Their mother had died on February 16, 1942, prompting the newspaper headline, "Mother Dies, Leaves 8 Children." 2 days after she was buried, there was a knock on the door. Cleveland told me it was a social worker. She worked for the Department of Public Welfare, he said, and under the table for Georgia Tann. "Are you taking care of your brothers and sisters?" she asked me. "Oh, you're such a good boy," she patted me on the head. Now it was 8 in the morning, and we were very poor. I just made oatmeal for everybody. Of course, the beds weren't made, and the oatmeal pan was in the sink. And on that little pretense, she filled out a report, "House unkept dishes in the sink." And the court took my sister away from my father. Judge Kelly turned her over to Georgia Tann. Cleveland went to see Georgia, begging for Shirley Ann's return, and Georgia Tann was pampering me to death. She said, "Look at the life of your sister's going to have. Don't worry, I'll always let you know where she's at." And they put my sister temporarily in a little building on Chelsea Avenue. I called Georgia Tann up and said, "I want to see my sister." She said okay. She took me over there and I visited for half an hour. Then Georgia said we had to go. They had to pull my sister away from me. I mean, absolutely, she was screaming. When Cleveland asked to see Shirley Ann the next week, Georgia told him she had a bad cold and couldn't take him. The following week it was, "Oh, she went shopping." And after that, blah, blah, blah. The next thing you know, I never saw my sister again. For the next 37 years, Cleveland searched for Shirley Ann, calling the police and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, writing letters to the Tennessee Department of Public Welfare, sometimes working as late as 2 a.m. He spent his annual 2-week vacations driving from his home in Fall River, Massachusetts, to the Memphis City Hall, where he poured through old records. In 1975, he visited the Department of Vital Statistics in Nashville, where he spoke with a worker who, like the Memphis Hall City employees, said she couldn't give him information about his sister because she had been adopted. I broke down and started crying. It was a big public building, and a crowd gathered. And I said, "Don't you tell me I don't have a sister named Shirley Ann. I was there. She was born at home, and I was there." Okay, pausing here. This is what we're talking about by we are legally separated through the vital statistics. Not only can our biological family not necessarily get information about our adoptions, we cannot get information about our biological family, right? It's like a guillotine, right? It's like we don't exist to the other side and they don't exist to us, even though DNA-wise we exist, right? But via vital records, we don't. And this is a huge thing. And now currently only the state of New York has begun to change this, and hopefully more states will follow. But there's still too few states where we can even get the basic original birth certificate without it being blacked out. So let's remember that we are still dealing with a lot of lack of human rights and lack of information. Okay. He apologized to the worker afterwards and returned home. Several months later, the woman sent him a letter. Somewhere in the future, if I can help you, I will. That gave me hope. He told me he sent the worker Christmas cards for 4 years. He always sent the same card, which had a religious theme. A lot of the family said, "Why don't you give up? She's probably dead by now. She probably forgotten about you," he told me. I said, if she's alive, I want her to know she has a brother that's been looking for her for 37 years. And in 1979, the Vital Statistics employee wrote to him, I could lose my job. I could lose everything by giving you this information. Your sister was adopted by a Hollywood couple in April of 1942. Cleveland and his wife immediately drove from New England to California, right to the door of the LA Times to put an ad in the paper. I had a little picture of my sister and put it next to the ad. It was a 1" by 2" and it ran on Mother's Day, May 13th, 1979. Georgia Tann had sent large number of children to Los Angeles. By 1979, many had long been searching for their families, and I got a lot of calls from women crying, saying, "That's me in the picture." None of them were Shirley Ann. But the ad also attracted the attention of 2 other Georgia Tann adoptees who were skilled in searching. Soon he was on the phone with the sister he hadn't seen in almost 40 years, and who, he discovered, had also been looking for him. But she was confused by his name, Cleveland. She recalled him by his nickname, Clebo. She cried for 5 minutes when she realized who he was. And I don't have these other brothers and a sister. Oh, she said, and don't I have these other brothers and a sister? Thomas, Roscoe, Charles, Elmer, Richard, and Thelma. Helma, honey, it's Velma, he told her. Her recall was remarkable, considering the fact that she'd only been 4 when stolen. Shirley Ann, who, when young, had resembled the child star of Shirley Temple, had been raised in mansions by a Hollywood actor and his wife who liked to show her off. She told Cleveland that they'd given her everything but love. Ooh, clock it. Yes, that is exactly what we are talking about. People think that adoption is love, that we're going to get everything, and they say that love is enough, but it isn't. It really isn't. And not knowing your family, your biological family, not knowing where you come from, being used to, well, in this case, to be shown off, right? Like an accessory, like a product, is utterly disgusting. But also, a lot of our parents, our adoptive parents, they use us to fulfill a fantasy of a family, right? That they cannot biologically have for whatever given reason. Some of them, not all of them, but they're also, I hate to say it, brainwashed, put in the fog. They're not told the truth. It's just, there is a lot to go through. Anyway, we're going to continue on. Georgia splintered so many families and caused so much pain. She forced some robbed mothers to bear the agony of seeing their children marketed in the newspaper. Adoptee Barbara Savin's mother kept the clipping advertising her baby daughter all her life, always hoping for a reunion with her, but she died before Barbara could find her. The practices of Georgia and her helpers seemed designed to inflict the greatest possible psychological damage. When Barbara Davidson was 6 years old, she found a kitten and brought it to her bed. The woman saw it and they drowned it in a rain barrel, and they made me watch, she said. And they said absolutely no animals allowed. Absolutely no animals. Then they put her hand in the water. Oh God, my hand in the water, and made me touch that tiny body. Oh, I swear to God, these people are serial killers, like a cult of serial killers. Ugh. The adoptees I spoke with agreed about what the state of Tennessee should do as compensation for having allowed Georgia to operate for 26 years. They wanted information that would help them find their lost relatives. One of the more vocal proponents was Roger Cleghorn, who, while in Georgia's custody, endured beatings with switches he himself was forced to fashion from tree branches. One broke while he was being beaten with it, and he was struck with terror. "I thought I'd be killed," he told me in 1993, seeking not deletion of or even compensation for his past, but reconnection to it. He had searched for years for his sister Glenna, unsuccessfully, with no help from the state of Tennessee. When I spoke with Barbara Davidson, she had long been reunited with her sister Mary, from whom Georgia Tann had separated her 50 years earlier. The last time we were together as children, we were in a big room with tile on the floor, and we must have known what was coming because we were clinging and crying, Barbara said. They wanted to take Mary away. Two women came in, and they couldn't get us apart, so they dragged Mary out of the room by the hair on her head. Mary had such beautiful long blonde hair, and one of the women just wrapped it around her hand, wrapped it around her hand like a rope, and dragged Mary away. And she was screaming, and I was screaming, "Mary, come back! Don't leave me! Come back!" But she never came back. They remained apart for the next 44 years, during which Barbara had to deal not only with the sexual abuse at the hands of a foster parent and her adoptive father, but with what had become of her nature. "I was surprised my adoptive mother didn't send me back," she said. "When I left Memphis, I was hateful, mean. I did terrible things to my new brother. Hit him every time he turned around. He'd go up and down the alleys digging in trash cans for something pretty to bring me, and I'd throw it at him. I pushed him down when he was roller skating, and I broke his glasses. I don't know what eventually turned me around, but I realized my adoptive mother loved me. By the time I was 10, I started smoothing out, caring more about people and what I was supposed to do. The years during which the sisters were separated, Mary, who was never adopted through foster homes, and as she grew older, the Tennessee Industrial Home and the Tullahoma Reform School, from which she escaped 3 times, only to be caught, returned, and punished. She was discharged at 18 and wearing the clothes she'd worn when she'd been admitted 5 years earlier. Hitchhiked to Chattanooga, where she found work in a beauty shop. She, like Barbara, eventually married and raised a family. The sisters were 44 and 46 years old when they reunited in 1986. The first time I saw Mary again was at the airport, and it was wonderful, wonderful, Barbara told me. We went to my house and talked about our pasts, lay across the bed and looked at each other's photo albums. We told each other things no one else will ever know. We laughed and we cried. We looked at each other's clothes and asked, "What size shoe do you wear?" Stupid things sisters should have been doing all these years. And we did it in one night. But it was a wonderful, wonderful night. At 4 a.m., my husband woke up and said, "Aren't you two girls asleep yet?" Like we were a couple of 13-year-old kids. It was great. It was really, really great. It was the most wonderful night of my life. When I began talking to the two sisters in the 1990s, they spoke with each other frequently, but their renewed closeness had not exempted them from problems regarding their past. Barbara, quieter and more reserved than her older sister, had particular difficulty. "I talked to no one about what had happened," she told me. "I wanted to get on with my life. I didn't want to go backward. I thought I'd been through too much already. I didn't need to remember, but I was wrong. 11 years ago, I started having flashbacks. It was horrible. For decades, I'd been level-headed, and now I fell apart. They'd come at me, flash in front of me, and I'd see myself as a child. Sometimes they'd come out of nowhere. Other times, they'd have a trigger. One day, I was in a store, and a woman grabbed her little boy by the hair and lifted his feet off the floor and hit him so hard. That was me all over again. George's women didn't hit us when we were on the floor. They had to have us up in the air. It went all through me. I dropped my groceries and looked at the mother in the eye, and I was crying. And I said, "Don't hit him. Don't you dare hit him." It made her stop. I guess I had a look on me like I would have killed her. "I'm only letting myself remember some things," she said. "There's a lot more that wants to come out. A lot of people say it would help to talk about it, but I don't have anyone to talk about it. I don't have anyone to talk to about it." "Not even," I asked, "your sister, your husband?" "I can't bother Mary with it. Her past was harder than mine. As for my husband," she told him some things, but out of embarrassment or shame, could not get out the rest. Psychiatrists, she feared, wouldn't believe her stories. And for the first time, I realized there had been a consequence of the passage of the 1951 law legalizing Georgia Tann's illegal adoptions that was almost as harmful as the continued separation of adoptees from their kin. By covering up the scandal, legislators had denied its magnitude, even its very existence. And if Georgia's crimes had been unimportant enough to ignore, adoptees must have felt how insignificant must be the pain they had caused. Did this account for the stoicism I'd sense in so many of Georgia's adoptees? Was it fear of being considered exaggerators that caused some to justify the abuse? To say, as had the former orphanage resident who'd given 5 across the face for refusing his breakfast, "It gotten my attention and I choked down the food." I feared that Barbara Davidson was ashamed and that she believed that she was weak. Remedying this, I thought, would require the same change as would the reunification of separated family members. The release of adoptees' original birth certificates and adoption records. This would be no panacea for adoptees seeking reunion, since the information in Georgia's records was often false. But the opening of Tennessee's adoption records would be an admission that they should never have closed. A terrible wrong has been done to you. It would state you have a right to be angry and sad. By the 1990s, Georgia's victims fight for access to their original birth certificates, and adoption records was led by the Tennessee Coalition for Adoption Reform. 3,000-member group headed by Memphis search expert Denny Glad and adoptee Caprice East. Caprice, who'd been born after Georgia's death and hadn't been directly affected by her, was nevertheless appalled by her crimes. One of my many informants regarding possible changes in Tennessee's adoption law was Billy Hale, who sent me copies of letters he'd written to the governor and other elected officials, pressing for legislative change. The next time Billy called, he spoke of having attended several committee meetings chaired by Denny Glad. He sounded animated, strong. Our former roles seemed reversed, for I had just spoken with Barbara Davidson, who had cried, and I sounded sad. "What's wrong?" he asked. I explained how having never undergone experience such as Barbara, would adequately talk to her, but that she didn't want to bother her sister Mary, who, having never been chosen by an adoptive family, had been worse off than she. Billy asked for her number. It doesn't comfort adoptees like Billy and Barbara to know that Georgia Tann was never happy. She was unhappy despite the approximately $1 million she made from her black market business and all that it bought her: cars, furs, homes in Memphis, best residential section, several rental properties, a tourist court, 200 acres of timberland, a vacation home in Biloxi, Mississippi, and a small hotel in California. And from 1938 to 1943, she owned Tannwood, a 7-acre rural estate on the border of Memphis and Mississippi. Tannwood had cedar persimmon magnolia, and dozens of other kinds of trees, as well as hollows and hills and greenery, enclosed paths upon which she and Anne rode their horses every morning. Tanwood was the setting of the only photograph I've ever seen in which Georgia, dressed in a plaid shirt and trousers, astride her horse, looks comfortable. But she couldn't relax, even at Tanwood. Instead of using the farm as a respite, she worked it with the precision with which she spoke on matters unrelated to her home. She told a Memphis reporter of canning 1,815 jars of strawberries, grapes, peaches, pears, plums, apples, figs, blackberries, butter beans, string beans, corn, okra, peppers, peas, beets, pimentos, tomatoes, and squash. She tended and named every one of her 12 hens, 23 turkeys, 26 ducks, 42 guinea pigs, 5 calves, 4 hogs, 3 horses, and 2 dogs. She even found time to force parenthood on one of her animals, slipping newborn ducklings beneath a sleeping and infertile duck named Mrs. Goo Goo, who woke to find herself the mother of quintuplets. Georgia's obsession with manipulating human families and frustration at her inability to control everyone may have contributed to her chronic bad temper. She became high-strung and blew off steam at the slightest excuse, said a Memphis taxi driver in 1950. Her most frequent targets were birth parents and the reformed-minded social workers she called that bunch. Her anger also affected adoptees and occasionally even her clients. While she fawned over most adoptive parents, particularly those of great wealth and social prominence, she hounded others, extorting large donations. She terrified people, said former social worker Mildred Stoves, whose friend had adopted through Georgia. He was a teacher and didn't make much money, and Georgia would ask for $2,000, $3,000. His wife would tell me, "Mrs. Tan's threatening us. The threat is veiled, but..." On the stakes this high, Mildred assured me, adoptive parents scraped up what they could. Mildred's friends were fortunate in being able to satisfy Georgia's demands. When another couple was unable to pay the $1,500 she demanded of them, she took back their adopted child. Holy shit. Like, we were joking about that, but she actually took children back because of non-payment. Georgia's withholding of medical information about her children also hurt adoptive parents and children. In 1949, a pediatrician at the Vanderbilt Hospital in Nashville spoke of several tragedies that could have been prevented if the adoptive parents had had full social and medical information before them at the time of the adoptions. Jesus. One concerned a child who had been irreparably damaged in eyes, heart, and mind by a case of German measles, which his mother had during pregnancy. He told of another case regarding the adoptive placement of 4 children, all born to the same mother. As fast as the children were born, there was someone, Georgia Tan, taking the children out of her hands and handling adoptions of them. He said she, the mother, had syphilis at the time the last child was born, and that child was adopted by a clergyman who knew nothing of the background. Georgia also sometimes reneged on her promises to prospective clients. In March of 1947, Mrs. W.A. Hackmeister of Memphis arrived at the home to pick up the infant girl she'd been promised, only to discover that Georgia had changed her mind about the placement. It was to have been an unusually open adoption for the time. The baby's mother had chosen Mrs. Hackmeister and her husband as adoptive parents. Georgia had also agreed to this 2 months before the baby's birth. Once the child was born, however, Georgia refused to let Mrs. Hackmeister adopt her. Georgia's purported reason was that Mrs. Hackmeister and the baby's mother were of different religions. It was an odd justification, considering that many non-Jewish children Georgia placed with Jewish clients, but she felt no need for logic or kindness. She ignored Mrs. Hackmeister as she pled for the baby, promising to have her baptized and raised in the Catholic religion of her birth. Georgia kept the infant. Shortly afterward, the child was removed from the home to the Methodist hospital, where she expired, death resulting from dysentery evidently contracted at the home. Mrs. Hackmeister wrote to her attorney in 1949, "This little soul's physical form lies in a nameless grave, a symbol of sacrifice." Georgia's cruelty extended even to her own family members, whom she played off against each other by giving her current favorite expensive gifts. She caused such a jealousy between her adopted daughter June and her partner Anne that years later June refused to let her son and daughter play with children who, although unrelated to Anne, happened to bear the same surname, Hollingsworth. Georgia was cruel to June even on the occasion of her marriage to a man Georgia didn't like. Georgia boycotted the wedding and during June's honeymoon destroyed the clothing she left at home. It really doesn't surprise me that Georgia was as cruel at home as she was in her business. To people, like, she is just a narcissist and a horrible person, right? Like, just not surprising. Anyway, Georgia was a successful businesswoman, but she wasn't emotionally steady. In 1928, she suffered such a nervous upset that, wrote Anne, she can't attend to business matters. In 1933 and 1934, Anne described Georgia as near a nervous breakdown and almost to the breaking point. Georgia herself told a Memphis reporter that in 1941, she had been tired, worn out, on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She dealt with this by buying tanwood. June's daughter, Vici Finn, described another way in which her grandmother dealt with tension, temporarily leaving the running of her home to her attorney and several of her workers. Georgia would disappear into her house with Anne for a few weeks and emerge as if everything was all right. Vici also said that Georgia could be very impulsive. On the spur of the moment, she would just take off for Cuba. My mother and father, June's second husband, whom Georgia liked, wouldn't even know she was gone. Georgia would call and say, "Get down here right now. Drop everything. I want you to come down and keep me company. Let's go swimming. Let's party. Let's gamble." Georgia's ability to summon the energy to be vicious and lively. And lively seemed particularly remarkable considering her physical problems, which besides several severe arthritis and a limp caused by a car accident included heart attacks suffered in 1941 and 1943. In 1945, doctors at the Mayo Clinic diagnosed her with cancer. She refused surgery and until her death in 1951 relied upon narcotics for pain. Georgia had other difficulties as well, for not even Crump could stop the letters of complaint about her that poured in from all over the country. Georgia and her attorney received angry letters from lawyers in Mississippi, Maryland, Missouri, Arkansas, Alabama, Indiana, New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and California. Many demanded information about the children Georgia planned to place with their clients. Abe Waldor dealt with these complaints by threatening Georgia's cancellation of the proposed adoption, at which point most prospective adoptive parents probably muzzled their lawyers. Fighting with the Tennessee legislature took more muscle. By 1945, Georgia's practices were widely criticized by ethical social workers and others in Tennessee, and a bill that would have required her to assess the qualifications of adoptive parents reached the legislature. Georgia worked furiously blackmailing clients into sending telegrams opposing the bill. Using her political contacts, particularly her attorney, without the knowledge of the bill's sponsor, Abe Waldor gathered a quorum of Crump-appointed legislators to a secret meeting held before the state Senate's regular session and had the bill defeated. In 1947, Tennessee adoption reformers drafted a bill authorizing the state welfare department to investigate adoption proceedings. Again, utilizing their Crump connections, Georgia and Abe had the bill buried in committee. Georgia's biggest legislative challenge occurred in 1949. By then, the adoption reform group included Judge Samuel Bates and the Memphis pediatricians, who 3 years earlier had complained about Georgia, members of the clergy, and civic groups like Junior League and the League of Women Voters. Some adoptive parents were also involved, motivated in part by her blackmailing of them. Adoptive father Jesse Jackson, a Memphis florist, told a reporter in 1950, "I found that I was being used by Mrs. Tan as a tool. I finally told her I was through being used in such fashion." He described how Georgia would address a telegram to state legislators, urging them to vote against adoption reform and demand that it be sent over his signature. She used many other adoptive parents in the same way until they rebelled as I did, he said. Even more threatening to Georgia was the fact that Boss Crump had lost his statewide power with the 1948 election of political outsiders Gordon Browning and Estes Kefauver as governor and senator. Georgia worked furiously, bribing a pivotal legislator with the gift of 2 adopted children and getting the support of as many adoptive parents as possible. But after 24 years of suffering under Georgia Tan, Memphians were fed up. During heated legislative fighting in Nashville, the former Children's Bureau social worker who objected to Georgia's adoption methods in 1925, but who, because of Georgia's stranglehold on Tennessee's adoptions, had later been forced to adopt through her, gave a speech supporting adoption reform. Afterwards, she walked into the Capitol lobby where she saw Georgia Tan and Georgia Robinson, superintendent of the Porter Home and Leith Orphanage. Intense conversation. "I hope you understand how I felt," the adoptive mother said. "I certainly do understand how you felt," Georgia Tan retorted. Then in a hostile tone, she added, "I think you ought to know that I recently had a letter from the mother of your child." The adoptive mother considered this a threat to tell her son's mother where he was living. Like most adoptive parents of the time, she didn't want her child to meet the mother who'd borne him, and she burst into tears. The reform bill passed both houses anyway, inspiring Georgia and her attorney to a desperate move. The pro and anti-reform camps had agreed upon an amendment excluding the bill's second paragraph, which had nothing to do with Georgia Tan. The amendment directed the striking of the entire second paragraph of Section 5. Secretly gaining access to the bill's rough draft, Abe Waldor inserted a caret between second and paragraph, adding the words "and third" and then an S at the end of paragraph. The amendment now directed the exclusions of not only the second paragraph, but the third one, which contained the reform measures aimed at curbing Georgia. The governor signed the botched bill, and it became law. Do they not double check things? Like, holy mackerel. It would be Georgia's last success, and she must have known it, for while Crump maintained control of Memphis until his death in 1954, his influence in the state capital had lessened. In 1950, 3 prominent Memphis adoptive fathers complained to Governor Browning about Georgia's blackmailing of them, and that fall he determined to close down her home. No hero, he apparently meant to delay announcement of Georgia's crimes until after her death, and dealt with her in response to the complaints not of long-suffering adoptees and birth parents, but of adoptive parents who had, in the main, profited from her. Browning so hamstrung investigator Robert Taylor as to ensure the superficiality of the idealistic young attorney's probe. Georgia, of course, may not have anticipated the shallowness of the investigation of her crimes, and the prospect of even the most cursory inspection would have appalled her. Death may have been a relief. It was certainly at hand. Increasingly debilitated by cancer, she was confined to her bed by August 12, 1950. and attended by a nurse. For the past few years, knowing death was near, she spent money madly on cars, furs, and the refurbishing of her residences. She sent her daughter June and her husband on trips all over the country, urging them to stay in the most elegant hotels. Her last purchases, made a month later, were strictly utilitarian: syringes, catheters, a hospital bed. At the end, she left her home on Stonewall Court only for medical treatment, including almost daily trips by ambulance between August 29th and September 7th for x-ray treatments to the pelvis. On September 11th, she was too ill to make this trip. She died at her home in the four-poster bed at 4:20 a.m. on September 15th, surrounded by her family and a few friends. Her death came just 3 days after she'd been exposed in news articles, and some Memphians speculated that she had killed herself from the shame. Her mother, who survived her, brittled at the rumor Sissy, her name for Georgia, didn't do that, she said frequently after. Other citizens implied that Georgia's death had been encouraged by her helpers, and its timing was convenient for people beside herself. Dead women can't rat on their confederates, but it's as much more likely that she died naturally of cancer. Services were held in Memphis the day after her death. She was buried in the local cemetery in Hickory, Mississippi on September 17th. She had on a beautiful orchid negligee with great big orchid pinned on her, a resident told me. Georgia may finally have been at peace, but her collaborators were not. A few days after the funeral, men in suits came in a big Ford. A Hickory woman told me. They asked my husband and me if we knew Georgia Tann. My wife was at the gravesite, my husband told them. Was it an open casket, they asked me. Yes, I said. Was it her? Yes. Really? Truly. Georgia was really dead. Of course, her collaborators continued to worry until even the most skittish realized the limited scope of Browning's investigation, and adoptive parents across the country were terrified. Actor Dick Powell, who with wife June Allison had adopted a baby through Georgia, vowed to fight any effort to make him return his child. If they come get my daughter, they will have to bring a large cannon, he said. He and other adoptive parents were quickly mollified by the passage of the Tennessee's law that legalized Georgia's illegal adoptions. As for Georgia herself, she had won again, slipping away without being held accountable for her crimes. She bequeathed little but embarrassment to her family members, who, accustomed to her wealth, were left in relative poverty. Of the $1 million she made, only $80,000 worth of stocks and property remained. Okay, only? That's still a lot of money even back then. Like, think about that. By the time the lawsuit against her was settled 9 years later, her estate dwindled to $45,000, and the state attached 2/3 of that. Okay, but that's still like, okay, maybe it's a little less than half, but I mean, that's still a lot of money. Just ridiculous. She left no money for children's causes or for the institution that had consumed her. She had left adoption a terrible legacy. This chapter ends with, the law must be constant with life. Mankind is possessed of no greater urge than to try to understand the age-old question, who am I? Judge Wade S. Weatherford, Jr., South Carolina's 7th Judicial Circuit Court, ruling on an adoptee's petition to gain access to adoption records. The fact that they're still complaining about the money, despite there still being a decent amount left, and yes, they took more than half of what was left when she died, they still had money left from her. But also, like, one, you're not owed money from your family, right? Let's start with that. Number two, like, no amount of money is ever going to take place and change the pain that these adoptees and these birth parents went through. And the fact that these adoptive, okay, like, I know it's selfish, but the fact that these adoptive parents were too concerned that their product, the child, would be taken away versus, hey, what's in the best interest? Can we gain access to their records so we know what's best? Like, they really just never actually cared about adoptees. Let's be real. Anyway, I hope you all have a great day, and I will see you guys tomorrow for another chapter.